The desert didn't care that Rowan Mercer was dying inside. It kept burning under the same merciless Arizona sun, kept cracking the earth into puzzle pieces of dust, kept pushing heat through air so thick it felt like breathing through wet wool. The mesas stood where they'd always stood, red and ancient and completely indifferent to human suffering, which was fine by Rowan. He preferred things that didn't pretend to give a damn. 11 years he'd lived out here on the edge of everything. 11 years since the frontier took his wife and newborn son in one blood-soaked night of failed childbirth. 11 years of waking up alone, working alone, eating alone, and going to sleep hoping maybe this time he just wouldn't wake up. But he always did. Every goddamn morning the sun came back, and so did he, and the ranch kept limping along because apparently even grief couldn't kill some things. The house looked like what it was, a place where hope had died and nobody bothered with a funeral. Paint peeled off the walls in long curls. The porch sagged on one side where a support beam had rotted through 3 winters ago. Windows stayed shuttered even in daylight, because what was the point of letting sun into rooms nobody used? The barn leaned slightly east, held upright more by habit than structural integrity. Fences ran in crooked lines across the property, missing slats, wrapped in tumbleweeds, marking boundaries nobody respected anymore. Rowan knew exactly how pathetic it all looked. He just didn't care. He'd spent the last 5 days moving cattle across the northern range, where the grass had burned to nothing under weeks of drought. The steers moved slow, too hot to protest, their ribs showing through dusty hides. Water was scarce. Shade was scarcer. By the 3rd day, Rowan had stopped talking to himself, stopped singing the old trail songs his father taught him, stopped doing anything except putting one boot in front of the other while his horse plodded forward with the resigned patience of an animal that knew its owner had lost his mind years ago. On the 5th day, with his canteen empty and his lips cracked and bleeding, Rowan finally turned the herd toward the home pasture. The cattle would survive or they wouldn't. He was too exhausted to pretend he controlled anything anymore. The sun was setting when he crested the final ridge and saw his ranch spread out below in the valley. That's when he smelled the smoke. At first, he thought it was a wildfire. His hand went automatically to his rifle. But the smoke wasn't the thick black column of burning grassland. It was thin, gray, rising in a controlled line from his chimney, which hadn't produced smoke in 11 years. Rowan pulled his horse to a stop and stared. The light was fading fast, that strange purple twilight the desert gets right before dark, but he could see clearly enough. Smoke, from his house, rising steady and purposeful like someone was cooking supper. The hell? His voice came out as a croak. He hadn't spoken in 5 days. He touched his heels to the horse's sides and started down the slope, moving faster now, his exhaustion forgotten. His mind ran through possibilities. Drifters breaking in to squat for the night. Bandits using his place as a hideout. Some fool cowboy who'd gotten lost and figured an abandoned-looking ranch was fair game. Except it wasn't abandoned. It was his. And whoever was in there was about to have a very bad evening. As he got closer, other details emerged. The front door stood open. Not kicked in, just open, like someone had walked through it with permission. Lamplight glowed in the kitchen window. And beneath the wood smoke, he caught something else. Bread. Fresh-baked bread. And coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt chicory substitute he'd been choking down for months. Rowan dismounted 20 yards from the house and tied his horse to the fence post. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and worked the lever, chambering around with a metallic click that sounded too loud in the quiet evening. "Whoever's in there," he called out, his voice rough as gravel. "You got about 10 seconds to show yourself before I start shooting through walls." No response. He moved toward the door, boots crunching on hard-packed dirt. "I ain't joking. This is private property and you're trespassing." Still nothing. Rowan stepped onto the porch, and the boards creaked under his weight the way they always did. The smell of food got stronger. His stomach twisted with hunger he'd been ignoring for days. Through the open door he could see into his kitchen that he hadn't properly used since his wife died, where dust had settled over everything like a burial shroud. Except now it was clean. The table had been scrubbed, the stove was lit with pots steaming on top of it, the floor had been swept, even the curtains looked like someone had taken them down and washed them. And standing at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in a pot, was a woman. She wore a plain gray dress, practical and worn, with her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, dark brown streaked with gray. She wasn't young, probably somewhere in her 40s, and she wasn't small. She had the build of someone who'd spent a lifetime doing hard work and hadn't stopped yet. "You can put the rifle down," she said without turning around. Her voice was calm, almost flat, like she was commenting on the weather. "I'm not here to steal anything." Rowan stood in the doorway with his rifle raised and his brain trying to catch up with what he was seeing. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Evelyn Vale." She kept stirring whatever was in the pot. "And you must be Rowan Mercer." "That's my name on the deed, which you'd know if you bothered to check before breaking into my house." "I didn't break in. The door was unlocked." She finally turned to face him, and Rowan got his first good look at her. She had a hard face. Not ugly, just worn down by life until all the soft parts had been sanded away. Gray eyes that didn't flinch when they met his. A jaw that looked like it knew how to clench and hold against bad news. Lines around her mouth and across her forehead that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind and probably a fair amount of pain. "The door's always unlocked," Rowan said, "because there's nothing here worth stealing." "Well, I stole your kitchen for the evening," Evelyn said. "Figured you'd be hungry when you got back. Supper's almost ready." She turned back to the stove like the conversation was over. Rowan lowered his rifle, mostly because he was too confused to keep pointing it at someone who was making him food. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's not a game." She pulled a loaf of bread from the oven, using a towel to protect her hands. The smell hit Rowan like a physical thing, and his stomach growled so loud he knew she heard it. "6 months ago, you wrote to the Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Agency in Denver, requesting a housekeeper." "Oh. Oh no." The memory came back like a kick to the chest. Last winter, during a 3-day blizzard when the loneliness had gotten so bad, he'd started having conversations with his dead wife's ghost. He'd been drunk on cheap whiskey and desperate enough to do something stupid. He'd written a letter, barely coherent, probably, asking if they could send someone to help around the ranch. He'd forgotten about it the next day. Assumed nothing would come of it. Figured the agency would take one look at his rambling mess of a letter and throw it in the trash where it belonged. Apparently he'd been wrong. "I asked for a housekeeper," he said slowly, "not a wife." "The agency doesn't do housekeepers." Evelyn set the bread on the table. "They do marriages. I'm what they sent." "Then they sent you to the wrong place." "Maybe." She started ladling stew into 2 bowls. "But I'm here now, and you look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in a week, so sit down and eat before you fall over." Rowan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to get out, get on the next stage back to wherever she came from, leave him alone to his carefully maintained misery. But his legs were shaking from exhaustion, and the smell of that food was breaking down his willpower faster than his pride could rebuild it. He propped his rifle against the wall and sat down at the table. Evelyn set a bowl in front of him without ceremony, then sat across from him with her own bowl. She started eating without waiting for him, like they'd been sharing meals for years. Rowan picked up his spoon and took a bite. It was good. Better than good. Beef stew with actual vegetables. Carrots, potatoes, onions, cooked until everything was tender and the broth was rich enough to make his eyes water. Or maybe that was just because he hadn't tasted real food in so long he'd forgotten what it was like. He ate half the bowl before he managed to speak again. "Where'd you get the supplies?" "Town. Rode in yesterday, bought what I needed, came back here." "With what money?" "My own." She tore off a piece of bread. "I'm not completely destitute, yet." They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the last of the daylight faded and the desert settled into its evening routine. Crickets starting up their chorus, a distant coyote testing the air with a tentative howl, the wind shifting from hot to cold in the space of minutes. Rowan finished his bowl and sat back, feeling more human than he had in days. "You traveled all the way from Denver?" he asked. "Vermont originally, then Denver, then here." Evelyn pushed her empty bowl aside. "Took me 6 weeks total." "That's a hell of a trip for a marriage proposal you never got." Something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe, or anger, or just exhaustion. It passed quickly. "The agency showed me your letter," she said. "Told me you were a widower with a ranch in Arizona. Decent man, they said. Hard worker. Lonely. I figured lonely I could work with. And when you got here and found out I wasn't actually looking for a wife?" Too late by then. She met his eyes without flinching. I spent everything I had getting here. Got no money for a return trip. Got no family back east willing to take me in. Got nothing but what I'm wearing and what's in that bag by the door. Rowan glanced toward the entrance and saw a worn leather travel bag sitting on the floor, probably containing everything this woman owned in the world. So you're stuck, he said. We're both stuck. Her voice stayed level, but he heard steel underneath. You with a wife you didn't want. Me with a husband who won't have me. The bluntness of it caught him off guard. Most women would have cried by now, or gotten angry, or tried to manipulate him with feminine tears and wounded pride. Evelyn just sat there looking at him like they were business partners negotiating a bad contract. Why'd you leave Vermont? He asked. My husband died in a mining collapse 2 years ago. His family blamed me, said I distracted him the morning of the accident, made him late to his shift, put him in the wrong place at the wrong time. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was reciting someone else's story. They convinced half the town I was cursed, that any man who loved me was doomed. My own sister stopped talking to me. Eventually I figured I might as well go somewhere nobody knew my name. And you picked the middle of the Arizona desert. The agency picked it. I just said yes. She stood and started collecting their dishes. Seemed like anywhere was better than there. Rowan watched her move through his kitchen with easy efficiency, washing bowls in the basin, wiping down the table, putting things away like she'd been doing it her whole life. Which she probably had. Women like her didn't come from money or leisure. They came from hard work and harder choices. I can't marry you, he said. I know. I mean it. I don't want a wife. I don't want anything. I heard you the first time. Then what do you want from me? Evelyn dried her hands on a towel and turned to face him. In the lamplight, her face looked older, more tired, like the day had finally caught up with her. 6 months, she said. Let me stay for 6 months. I'll work for my keep, cook, clean, mend, whatever needs doing around here. In exchange, you give me room and board until I save enough money to move on. No marriage, no promises, no expectations. Just 6 months of honest work. And then what? Then I leave. Find a town somewhere, get a job, start over, again. She said it like she'd already started over more times than she could count. 6 months won't kill you, Mr. Mercer, and from the look of this place, you could use the help. He wanted to say no, wanted to tell her that he'd gotten along fine for 11 years without help, and he'd get along fine for 11 more. Wanted to protect the fortress of isolation he'd built so carefully around his grief. But the truth was sitting right there in the clean kitchen, in the taste of real food still on his tongue, in the way the house felt less like a tomb with another living person inside it. And maybe he was just too tired to keep dying alone. 6 months, he said. You work, I'll provide room and board, but we're not... He gestured vaguely between them. We're not anything else. Agreed. You stay out of my business. I stay out of yours. Fine. And if it doesn't work out, then I leave early. No arguments. She extended her hand across the table. Deal? Rowan looked at her hand for a long moment. Rough palm, calloused fingers, nails trimmed short and practical. A working woman's hand that had seen its share of hard labor and wasn't afraid of more. He shook it. Deal. The first week was hell. Not because Evelyn was difficult, she wasn't. And not because she got in his way, she didn't. The hell came from having another person in his space after so many years of solitude. It felt like wearing new boots that hadn't been broken in yet, all awkward friction and painful adjustment. She was up before dawn every morning, starting the stove, making coffee, cooking breakfast whether he wanted it or not. He'd gotten used to skipping meals, drinking bad coffee standing up, eating jerky in the saddle. Now there were eggs, biscuits, bacon when she could get it. Real food served at regular hours like he was something more than a ghost haunting his own property. It irritated the hell out of him. I can feed myself, he told her the third morning, standing in the kitchen doorway while she scrambled eggs. I'm sure you can. She didn't look up. But I'm feeding you anyway, part of the deal. The deal was you'd cook. Didn't say I had to eat. Then don't. More for me. He ate. By the end of the first week, she'd reorganized his entire kitchen, which annoyed him until he realized he could actually find things now. She'd washed all the linens he'd forgotten existed, including curtains he hadn't seen clean in over a decade. She'd swept out corners that had accumulated years of dust and mouse droppings. She'd even tackled the chicken coop, which had been abandoned since the last hen died 3 years ago. "I found eggs," she announced one evening, holding up 3 brown eggs like they were nuggets of gold. "Impossible. I don't have chickens." "You do now. They were living wild in the brush out back. Took me 2 days to catch them, but I got 4 hens and a rooster secured in the coop. We'll have fresh eggs every morning." Rowan stared at her. "You caught wild chickens." "They weren't that wild, mostly just feral. Different thing." "And you fixed the coop. It wasn't that broken. Just needed new wire and some boards patched. I found spare lumber in the barn." He didn't know what to say to that, so he nodded and went back to his work. But inside, something was shifting. The ranch was changing, not just becoming cleaner or more organized. It was coming back to life. Little things he'd stopped noticing were suddenly visible again. The way morning light came through clean windows, the smell of bread baking instead of dust and decay, the sound of chickens clucking instead of silence. It should have made him happy. Instead, it scared him half to death, because the ranch had been his monument to loss. Every broken thing was a reminder of what he'd failed to save. Every neglected corner represented the parts of himself he'd given up on. And now this woman was fixing it all, piece by piece, like she thought something here was worth saving. He found her on the porch one evening, mending a pile of his shirts with quick, efficient stitches. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Holes don't mend themselves. I mean, you don't have to fix everything. Some things are meant to stay broken." Her hands paused mid-stitch. She looked up at him with those gray eyes that saw too much. "Nothing's meant to stay broken, Mr. Mercer. Some things just haven't been fixed yet." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." She went back to sewing. "Because I was broken too, and I'm still here." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that his situation was different, that his grief was permanent, that she didn't understand what it was like to lose everything in one night. But the words stuck in his throat because he could see the lie in them. She did understand, maybe better than he wanted to admit. So he sat down in the other porch chair and watched the sun set while she mended his clothes. And they didn't talk, but somehow it felt less lonely than the 11 years that came before. The drought got worse. By the second week, the well was producing more mud than water. The creek that usually ran year-round had dried to a trickle. The cattle were suffering, ribs showing, eyes dull with thirst. Every morning, Rowan would walk the property looking for moisture and finding only dust. "We need to haul water from the river," Evelyn said one morning, studying the situation with the calm assessment of someone who'd dealt with worse. "That's a 10-mile round trip. In this heat. With a loaded wagon. You got a better plan?" He didn't, so they hitched the wagon and made the trip. It took 6 hours down and back, loading heavy barrels from the river while the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. By the time they returned to the ranch, they were both exhausted, sunburned, and soaked with river water that had sloshed over the sides. But the cattle drank, and that mattered. They made the trip again 2 days later, and again 3 days after that. It became a brutal routine, loading water, hauling water, distributing water, collapsing into sleep, waking up to do it all again. On the 4th trip, disaster struck. They were halfway back to the ranch when the wagon hit a rut hidden under drifted sand. The whole rig lurched sideways, barrels shifting with enough momentum to tip the entire load. Rowan felt it going and lunged to grab the barrels while simultaneously hauling on the reins to keep the horses from bolting. "Evelyn, grab the what?" She was already moving, throwing her weight against the barrels on the other side, fighting to counterbalance the shift. The wagon teetered on 2 wheels for a long, terrible moment, while hundreds of pounds of water tried to decide which way gravity would win. Then Rowan's foot slipped in the mud, and he went down hard, dragging half the barrels with him. Water exploded everywhere. He hit the ground on his back with a barrel landing on his chest, driving the air from his lungs in a painful whoosh. He heard Evelyn shout something, maybe his name, maybe a curse, and then she was there, shoving the barrel off him, hands on his shoulders, her face white with fear. "Are you breathing? Rowan? Are you breathing?" He gasped like a drowning man breaking the surface, sucking air in painful hitches. "Stupid," he managed. "That was stupid." "You saved the load. Most of it, anyway." She sat back on her heels, still touching his shoulder like she needed to confirm he was solid. "But if you ever scare me like that again, I'll kill you myself." He almost laughed, but his ribs hurt too much. They spent the next hour salvaging what water they could, riding the wagon, checking the horses for injury. By the time they limped back to the ranch, the sun was setting and they were both covered head to toe in mud, water, and exhaustion. But they'd done it together. And somewhere in that struggle, in the moment when she'd looked at him with genuine fear that he might be hurt, something had shifted between them. He felt it that night while they ate supper in silence. She felt it too. He could tell. The way her eyes would flicker toward him and then away, like she was checking to make sure he was still breathing. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For today? You'd have done the same." "I mean it. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." She set down her fork. "That's what partnership looks like, Mr. Mercer. Two people keeping each other alive, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Partnership." The word hung in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. "We're not partners," he said, but it came out weaker than he intended. "Then what are we?" He didn't have an answer for that. The storms came at night. Not rain, the drought was too entrenched for that kind of mercy. Just wind and lightning and thunder that rolled across the desert like the sky was tearing itself apart. Rowan had lived through hundreds of storms in his years on the frontier. They didn't bother him anymore, but they bothered Evelyn. He didn't notice at first. She was too good at hiding it. But one night he got up for water and saw lamplight under her door. And the next night, the same thing. And the night after that. On the fourth night, when thunder cracked so loud it shook the house, he heard her cry out. He was through her door before he could think better of it. She was sitting on her bed fully dressed, knees pulled to her chest, hands clenched in her skirt. In the lightning flashes through the window, he could see her face, pale, eyes wide, breathing too fast. "Evelyn?" She looked at him like she'd forgotten other people existed. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "You're not." "I'm fine." Another crack of thunder. She flinched so hard her teeth clicked together. Rowan sat down in the chair by her door, far enough away to not crowd her, but close enough to be present. "How long have you been afraid of storms?" he asked. "I'm not afraid." "Evelyn?" She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind howled and threw sand against the windows like thousands of tiny claws. "After my husband died," she said finally, "they buried him in Vermont. Spring thaw. Ground was still half frozen, full of mud. The grave kept filling with water faster than they could dig." Her voice was flat, disconnected, like she was describing something that happened to someone else. "They had to pump it out 3 times during the service, and I just stood there watching him sink into cold water while thunder rolled overhead." Rowan felt something twist in his chest. "Now every time it storms, I see that grave filling up, hear that water rushing in, and I can't—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I can't breathe right." He understood that kind of fear, the kind that lived in your bones and came out when you least expected it, the kind that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with wounds that never properly healed. "My son was born during a thunderstorm," he heard himself say. "Worst storm I'd ever seen. Couldn't get to town for a doctor. Couldn't do anything except listen to my wife scream while the thunder drowned out everything else." He paused, surprised he was saying this out loud. For years after, every storm felt like that night happening again. Like I was trapped in that room holding my dead son, listening to the rain. I wanted to hate the storms. I wanted them to stop. But they didn't. No, they never do. They sat in silence while the storm raged outside. Every few minutes lightning would flash and Evelyn would tense, but she didn't cry, didn't apologize for her fear, just endured it. "I started going outside during storms," Rowan said, "standing in them. Not because it helped, but because I figured if lightning wanted to take me too, I'd make it easy." "Did it help?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No, but I'm still here, so maybe that's something." "Maybe." The storm lasted another hour. Rowan stayed in that chair the whole time, not saying much, just being there. When the thunder finally rolled away toward the eastern mountains and Evelyn's breathing returned to normal, he stood to leave. "Mr. Mercer?" He paused at the door. "Thank you for—" She gestured vaguely, "for not making me feel stupid." "You're not stupid. You're just—" He searched for the right word. "Human." He left before she could respond. But something had changed. Again. The walls he'd built so carefully were developing cracks, and the woman who'd invaded his house was slipping through them whether he wanted her to or not. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Evelyn tackled the garden. Rowan found her out back one morning, digging with a determination that suggested she'd already decided this patch of dead ground was going to produce vegetables whether it wanted to or not. "That soil's been dead for years," he called from the porch. "Nothing grows there." Then it's time it learned. He watched her work for a minute, impressed despite himself by her sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. "You know anything about gardening in the desert?" he asked. "Not a damn thing, but I'm learning." By afternoon, she'd cleared a plot, amended the soil with manure from the barn, and started planting seeds she'd bought in town. Tomatoes, beans, squash, peppers. Things that might survive if they got water and luck in equal measure. Rowan found himself helping without quite knowing how it happened. Digging rows, hauling water, building a fence to keep jackrabbits out. They worked side by side in the heat, and if it felt suspiciously like the partnership she'd mentioned, well, he tried not to think about that too hard. "Why are you doing this?" he asked during a water break. "The garden, the chickens, fixing everything. You're only here for 6 months. Because a place is either living or dying, no in between." She wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. "And I'm tired of living in dying places. This place was dying long before you got here." "I know. That's why I'm fixing it." "But why?" She looked at him with those steady gray eyes that never lied. "Because maybe if I can fix the place, I can fix myself too." The honesty of it hit him like a punch. No pretense, no manipulation, just raw truth from someone who'd been broken and was trying to figure out how to be whole again. "And if you can't?" he asked quietly. "Then at least I tried." That night, Rowan stood on the porch and looked at the garden plot. Just bare dirt and a few stakes marking where seeds lay buried. Nothing to see yet. Nothing that proved this wouldn't fail like everything else. But for the first time in 11 years, he found himself hoping something would grow. The rain came on a Tuesday. Not the violent monsoons that sometimes hit the desert. Just steady, soaking rain that fell from a gray sky and turned the dust to mud and made everything smell like wet earth and possibility. Rowan woke to the sound of it drumming on the roof and couldn't remember the last time he'd heard that particular music. The drought had lasted so long he'd started to believe rain was something that happened in other places, to other people. He found Evelyn standing on the porch in her nightgown and bare feet, face tilted up to the sky, arms spread wide, laughing. Actually laughing. He'd never heard her laugh before. Didn't know she could. The sound was bright and genuine and completely unexpected, like finding wildflowers in the middle of a rock slide. "Evelyn, you're going to catch your death." "I don't care." She spun in a circle, letting the rain soak her completely. "Do you see this? It's raining." I noticed. "We're saved! The ranch is saved!" He wanted to tell her not to count on it, that one rain didn't end a drought, that hope was dangerous out here. But she looked so happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way he hadn't seen anyone look in years, that he couldn't bring himself to crush it. So instead, he stepped off the porch into the rain. It was cold, shockingly cold after weeks of brutal heat. It soaked through his shirt in seconds and plastered his hair to his skull. He probably looked like a drowned rat. He didn't care. Evelyn turned to him, rain streaming down her face, eyes bright with something that might have been joy or might have been the kind of desperate relief that comes from surviving when you thought you wouldn't. "Dance with me," she said. "What?" "Dance with me, right now, in the rain." "I don't dance. Neither do I, so we'll be terrible together." Before he could protest, she grabbed his hands and started moving, some approximation of a waltz that had no rhythm and less grace. She was right, they were terrible. But she was laughing again, and somehow his feet remembered how to move, and they spun through the mud while rain poured down and the desert drank deep after months of thirst. For one perfect moment, Rowan Mercer forgot what it felt like to be alone. And that terrified him more than anything else that had happened in 11 years, because he could feel himself starting to care, starting to want, starting to imagine a future that included more than just survival. And hope. He'd learned the hardest way possible was the most dangerous thing the frontier had to offer. When the rain finally slowed to a drizzle, they stood in the middle of the muddy yard, breathing hard, soaked to the bone. Evelyn's hair had come loose from its bun and hung in wet ropes around her face. She looked younger somehow, less worn down, like the rain had washed away some of the weight she carried. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For dancing, even though you didn't want to." "Who said I didn't want to?" She smiled, a real smile, small but genuine, and Rowan felt something in his chest crack open just a little bit wider. This was going to be a problem. They spent the next day working in comfortable silence, fortifying fence posts that the rain had loosened, checking the animals, watching the garden plot hopefully for any sign of green. The rain had left everything feeling fresh and possible, like maybe the universe had decided to give them both a second chance. That night they sat on the porch while the sun set over the mesas, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that hurt to look at. "Tell me about her," Evelyn said suddenly. Rowan went still. "Who?" "Your wife. You've never said her name." He should have shut it down, changed the subject, reminded her that staying out of each other's business was part of the deal. But something about the rain, about the day they'd just shared, about the way she'd asked without demanding, it loosened the knot he'd kept tied tight around those memories. "Margaret," he said. "Her name was Margaret. Maggie to her friends." "How'd you meet?" "Town dance. I was 22, thought I knew everything. She proved me wrong in about 5 minutes." The memory came with less pain than usual. She had opinions, strong ones, about everything: politics, religion, how to properly saddle a horse. We argued more than we agreed, but... He paused, searching for words. "But she made me better. Pushed me to be more than just another cowboy drinking his life away." "She sounds formidable." "She was. Right up until the end." His voice went rough. "Labor went bad. Baby was breech. By the time I realized we needed help, it was too late to get to town. I tried everything I knew, but I didn't know enough. Couldn't save either of them." "And you've been punishing yourself ever since." It wasn't a question. "Wouldn't you?" he asked. "I did. For 2 years. Blamed myself for my husband dying because I'd made him late that morning. Made him take a different route. Put him in the wrong place at the wrong time." She picked at a splinter on the porch railing. "His family reinforced it, told me I was cursed, that death followed me. Eventually I started believing it." "But you stopped." "No, I just got tired of carrying it alone." She looked at him. "Guilt's heavier when you're the only one holding it." They sat in the growing darkness while crickets started their evening song and somewhere far off a coyote howled at the emerging stars. "I named him Thomas," Rowan said suddenly. "My son. Held him for 2 hours after he died, just talking to him, telling him about the ranch, about his mother, about the life he should have had. Probably sounds crazy. It sounds human. I buried them together, out behind the house, under the cottonwood tree. Visit them every morning, tell them good morning, tell them about the day ahead. Still do it, every single day for 11 years. That's not crazy either. Feels crazy sometimes. Grief always does." The night settled in around them like a blanket. For the first time, talking about Margaret and Thomas didn't feel like bleeding. It just felt like remembering. "Your turn," Rowan said. "Tell me about your husband." "James. He was a miner, worked hard, drank harder. Not a bad man, just broken in ways I didn't know how to fix." She smiled sadly. "I thought love would be enough. It never is, but you always think it will be." "How long were you married?" 8 years. No children. I wanted them, but it never happened. Maybe that was a blessing. Would have made leaving harder." "You think you'll marry again? After the 6 months?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "I don't know," she said finally. "Ask me again in 5 months when I have to leave." The reminder that she was leaving hung between them like smoke. 5 months left. Then she'd be gone, and the ranch would return to its slow decay, and Rowan would go back to being a ghost haunting his own life. Except now he'd know what it felt like to have another heartbeat in the house, another voice across the table, another person who understood that survival was just the first step, and living was the harder climb. "I should turn in," Evelyn said, standing. "Early start tomorrow." "Evelyn?" She paused at the door. I'm glad you're here. Even if I didn't want you to be, she smiled. I'm glad I'm here too. Even if you're the most stubborn man I've ever met. You've only known me 3 weeks. That's all it took. She went inside, leaving Rowan alone with the night and his thoughts, and the uncomfortable realization that somewhere in the last 21 days, his carefully constructed walls had developed serious structural damage. And the woman who'd done it hadn't even been trying. He sat on the porch until the stars came out in full force, thick and bright in the desert sky, and tried not to think about what would happen in 5 months when she left. But he thought about it anyway, and for the first time in 11 years, the thought of being alone again felt less like relief and more like drowning. The garden sprouted exactly 1 week after the rain. Rowan noticed it first during his morning walk to Margaret and Thomas's graves, tiny green shoots pushing through the dark soil like stubborn fists breaking through concrete. He stood there staring at them for a full minute, half convinced the heat had finally cooked his brain. But they were real. Living things where nothing had lived in years. He found Evelyn already in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with her hands pressed to the earth like she was taking its pulse. "Look," she said without turning around. She'd learned to sense when he was near, the same way he'd started listening for her footsteps in the morning. Tomatoes and beans both. The squash might take longer, but they're coming. Might not survive, still hot, still dry. Then we'll water them, keep them alive. For what? You're leaving in 5 months anyway. The words came out harsher than he intended. Evelyn's hand stilled in the dirt, and he watched her shoulders tense before she stood and turned to face him. Is that what this is about? Her voice stayed level, but he heard the edge underneath. You're angry because I'm not staying forever? I'm not angry. You sound angry. I'm just being realistic. No point getting attached to things that won't last. She brushed dirt from her hands with sharp, irritated movements. I'm keeping a garden alive, Rowan, not asking you to marry me. Could have fooled me with all the fixing you've been doing. What's that supposed to mean? Means you're making this place into something it's not. Making me think... He stopped, frustrated with himself for saying anything. Never mind. Forget it. No, say it. She crossed her arms. Making you think what? That maybe I could live here again instead of just haunting it. That maybe I could want something besides death. That maybe you being here matters more than it should. But he couldn't say any of that out loud without sounding pathetic. Nothing. It's nothing. You're a terrible liar. Yeah, well, you're a terrible guest. It was a stupid thing to say, and he knew it the moment the words left his mouth. Evelyn's face went hard in a way he hadn't seen since that first night, and when she spoke, her voice could have cut glass. I'm not a guest. I'm hired help working off a debt. Don't forget that, just because we had one nice conversation under the stars. She walked past him toward the house, her shoulder bumping his hard enough to make him step back. Rowan stood in the garden alone, surrounded by green shoots that suddenly felt like accusations, and wondered when exactly he'd become the kind of man who punished people for caring. They didn't speak for 2 days. Evelyn cooked meals and left them on the stove without calling him to eat. Rowan worked from dawn until dark, taking his horse farther into the range than necessary just to avoid coming back to the house. They moved around each other like ghosts, occupying the same space but refusing to acknowledge it. The drought returned with a vengeance. The single rain had been a tease, a brief moment of mercy before the desert remembered what it did best. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees and stayed there. The well dropped lower. The cattle went back to looking skeletal. On the third morning, Rowan woke to find Evelyn already gone. Her bedroom door stood open, the bed made with military precision. For one terrible moment, he thought she'd left, packed up in the night, and headed back to wherever people went when they gave up on lost causes. Then he heard the wagon. She was loading water barrels, preparing for the trip to the river. Alone. What are you doing? He called from the porch. What's it look like? She lifted another barrel into the wagon bed with a grunt. We need water. I'm getting water. That's a 2-person job. Then it's a good thing I'm twice as stubborn as most people. He walked down to the wagon, grabbed the next barrel before she could lift it. You can't do this alone. You'll kill yourself. Better than sitting here doing nothing. Evelyn, don't. She rounded on him. Don't pretend you care now. You made it very clear the other day that I'm just passing through. So let me pass through and do my job without any more of your guilt-soaked nonsense about what lasts and what doesn't. The words hit harder than he expected, mostly because they were accurate. I shouldn't have said that, he admitted. About the garden, about you leaving. It was stupid. Yes, it was. I meant about getting attached, not about you. The garden's, it's good. What you're doing is good. Wow, try not to strain yourself with all that enthusiasm. Despite everything, he almost smiled. I'm trying to apologize here. You're doing a terrible job. I know, I'm out of practice. He set the barrel in the wagon. Look, I've been alone a long time. I forgot how to talk to people without screwing it up. And He gestured vaguely at her. You're making everything complicated. How? By being here, by fixing things, by making me remember what it feels like to have someone around who gives a damn. The honesty felt like pulling splinters from his chest. And yeah, that scares me. Because in 5 months you're gone and I go back to being alone, except now I'll know what I'm missing. Evelyn studied him with those gray eyes that never let him hide. You think you're the only one scared? She asked quietly. I'm terrified, Rowan. Every single day. Because I came here thinking I'd just work for 6 months and move on, but this place is getting under my skin. You're getting under my skin, and I don't know what to do with that. They stood in the morning heat while the admission hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. So what do we do? Rowan asked. We haul water. We keep the ranch alive. We stop picking fights because we're too scared to admit we care. She climbed onto the wagon seat. And we take it one day at a time instead of mourning something that hasn't died yet. He hauled himself up beside her without asking permission. I'm coming with you. I figured. They rode toward the river in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not angry, just two people sitting with uncomfortable truths and trying to figure out what to do with them. The trip took 7 hours. The heat was brutal, the kind that made the air shimmer and turned sweat to salt crystals on skin before it could properly evaporate. They filled barrels, loaded them carefully, and started the long haul back with the wagon creaking under the weight. Halfway home, they stopped to rest the horses in the meager shade of a rock outcropping. Tell me about Vermont, Rowan said, passing her the canteen. Why? Because I realized I don't know anything about where you came from, just that you left. Evelyn drank deep before answering. Green. Everything was green. Trees, grass, moss on the stones. Rain fell so often people complained about it. She smiled at the memory. My husband hated the rain, said it made his joints ache. I used to stand outside during storms just because I could. Never had to worry about water, never had to think about whether things would grow. They just did. Sounds easier than here. Easier isn't always better. Things that come easy don't teach you much. She handed back the canteen. The desert's honest, at least. It tells you right up front it's trying to kill you. Vermont pretended to be gentle and then buried my husband under mud and blamed me for it. You really think they were wrong? His family? I think grief makes people cruel, and I was convenient. She picked at the wooden seat. James was late that morning because I asked him to fix the stove before he left. It was smoking, filling the house with fumes. If he'd gone to work on time, he'd have been in a different shaft when the collapse happened. So yeah, technically they were right. I did make him late. But I didn't cause the collapse. The mine owner's cheap timber did that. Only nobody wanted to sue a rich man when they could blame a poor widow instead. Idiot. That's horseshit. Welcome to how the world works. Rowan thought about that while the horses rested and the sun beat down like a physical weight. How many times had he blamed himself for Margaret's death when the real culprit was just bad luck and a breech baby and the frontier's absolute refusal to make anything easy? I used to go to their graves every day, he said, and apologize. Tell them I should have done better. Should have seen it coming. Should have had a doctor there. Should have. He squinted at the horizon. Did that for 11 years straight. Never missed a day. And did it help? Not even a little bit. Then why keep doing it? Because if I stopped, I'd have to admit they're really gone. And I wasn't ready for that. He looked at her. Still not sure I am. Nobody's ever ready. You just do it anyway because the alternative is staying frozen. She stood, brushing off her skirt. Come on, these cattle need water more than we need rest. They climbed back onto the wagon and continued home as the sun started its slow descent toward the western mesas. The ranch appeared in the distance like a mirage, buildings shimmering in heat waves, looking small and temporary against the vast emptiness surrounding it. But there was smoke from the chimney where Evelyn had banked the morning fire, and the chicken coop with its 4 hens and rooster, and the garden with its stubborn green shoots, and 2 names carved above the door even though neither of them had mentioned it since Evelyn discovered it last week. It looked less like a tomb and more like a place where people actually lived. That night after they had distributed water to the cattle and eaten a quiet supper, Rowan found Evelyn on the porch staring at the stars. "I'm sorry," he said, sitting in the chair beside her, "for being an ass about the garden, about you leaving, about all of it." Apology accepted. She didn't look at him. "But you need to figure out what you want, Rowan, because I can't keep dancing around your grief while trying to manage my own." "What do you want?" "I want to stop feeling like I'm cursed. I want to wake up without wondering if today's the day something terrible happens. I want—" She paused. "I want to stay. Not just for 6 months, really stay. But I need to know if that's something you could actually handle or if you're going to panic and push me away the moment it gets real." The honesty of it stole his breath. "I don't know if I can handle it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." She finally looked at him, and he saw something in her expression that might have been disappointment, or might have been understanding, or might have been both. "Fair enough," she said quietly. "At least you're honest." They sat under the stars while coyotes sang in the distance, and the desert night wrapped around them like a blanket. Rowan wanted to say something profound, something that would fix what he'd broken with his fear, but words had never been his strength, and tonight they failed him completely. So he just sat there beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and hoped that proximity could communicate what his mouth couldn't. The drought showed no signs of breaking. Days blurred into weeks, blurred into months. The garden clung to life through sheer stubbornness and daily watering. The cattle survived because Rowan and Evelyn made the river trip every 4 days like clockwork, building a routine around survival. They stopped fighting, started talking more, shared stories about their dead spouses without the weight of guilt crushing every word, learned each other's rhythms, how she liked her coffee strong enough to strip paint, how he couldn't function before dawn without at least 10 minutes of silence, how they both used work to avoid feeling too much. Slowly, carefully, they built something that looked suspiciously like friendship, but underneath it ran a current neither of them acknowledged, the way her hand would brush his when passing dishes at supper, the way he'd watch her work in the garden with an expression that wasn't quite professional distance, the way they'd both stopped counting down the days until her 6 months ended and started pretending the deadline didn't exist. 4 months in, a traveling merchant stopped at the ranch offering supplies. "Didn't know anyone lived out here anymore," he said, eyeing the property with the calculating look of someone assessing value. "Heard the Mercer place was abandoned." "Well, you heard wrong," Evelyn said before Rowan could respond. She'd been kneading bread dough in the kitchen and came out with flour on her hands and steel in her voice. "The ranch is very much occupied. Now what are you selling?" The merchant's eyes flicked between them, reading the situation with practiced ease. "Didn't mean any offense, ma'am. Just surprised is all. Got dry goods, tools, ammunition, fabric if you need it." They bought coffee, sugar, flour, and lamp oil. The merchant lingered longer than necessary, clearly curious about the arrangement, but smart enough not to ask directly. After he left, Rowan found Evelyn scrubbing the kitchen table with unnecessary force. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine." "You don't look fine." "I said I'm fine." He pulled out a chair and sat. "Talk to me." She stopped scrubbing but didn't turn around. He looked at this place like it was already dead, like we're just squatters in a ruin. "So?" "So maybe he's right." Her voice cracked slightly. "Maybe we're just pretending, playing house in a place that's been dying for years and doesn't have the sense to quit. Is that what this feels like to you? Pretending?" She finally turned to face him, and he saw tears in her eyes that she was too proud to let fall. "I don't know what this is. I thought I did. Thought I'd work 6 months, save money, move on. But it's been 4 months and I haven't saved a damn thing because I keep spending it on seeds and chickens and supplies for a place I'm supposed to leave in 8 weeks. 8 weeks. The deadline hung between them like an axe waiting to drop. "You could stay," he said quietly. "Could I? Because every time I think you might actually want that, you remind me this is temporary, that I'm temporary. That's not fair. Isn't it?" She crossed her arms. "You carved my name above the door, Rowan. You did that. and then you won't talk about what it means. Won't acknowledge that maybe this stopped being a business arrangement somewhere around the second month. Won't admit that you're as scared as I am about what happens when my time's up. Of course I'm scared. I told you that. Telling me you're scared isn't the same as doing something about it. She wiped her eyes angrily. I can't stay here if you're always waiting for me to leave. And I can't leave if I think there's a chance you might actually want me to stay. So which is it? The question sat between them like a challenge. Rowan felt trapped by it, cornered by emotions he'd spent 11 years refusing to feel. Part of him wanted to tell her to go, to protect himself from the inevitable loss. The other part, the part that had started waking up grateful to hear her moving around the kitchen, the part that found excuses to work near wherever she was working, the part that had stopped visiting Margaret's grave every single morning because being with Evelyn felt more like living. That part wanted to beg her to stay. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what I want, except that the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I'm back in that room with Margaret dying, and I can't do a damn thing to stop it. I'm not Margaret, and I'm not dying. Everyone leaves eventually. Yeah, they do. That's called being human. She moved closer, her voice softer now. But some people leave because they have to, and some leave because you push them away. You need to figure out which one you're doing before those 8 weeks run out. She went back to the kitchen, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his fear and the uncomfortable realization that she was absolutely right. That night, Rowan lay awake staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around him. He could hear Evelyn moving in her room, getting ready for bed, probably as unable to sleep as he was. The walls between them felt thinner than ever. He thought about the last 4 months, how the ranch had transformed from a mausoleum into something that almost resembled a home. How Evelyn had taken his broken life and carefully, patiently helped him glue it back together. How she'd done it without asking for anything except honesty and maybe the chance to heal her own wounds in the process. And he thought about 8 weeks from now when she'd pack that worn leather bag and leave, and the silence would come roaring back worse than before, because now he knew what it felt like to have another heartbeat nearby. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was a calculation of which would hurt worse, keeping her and risking loss or pushing her away and guaranteeing it. The next morning, he found her in the garden, checking the tomato plants for signs of fruit. The sun was barely up, the air still holding that brief coolness before the desert remembered it was supposed to be hell. I want you to stay, he said without preamble. Evelyn's hands stilled on the plants. She didn't turn around. Past the 6 months? Yeah. Why? Because this place is better with you in it. I'm better with you in it. And I know I'm scared and I know I'm probably going to mess it up, but I'd rather try and fail than not try at all. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and when she turned to face him, her eyes were bright with something that looked like hope mixed with caution. You mean it? Would I say it if I didn't? You might. You've said a lot of things you didn't mean when you were scared. Fair point. He stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in her eyes, the lines around her mouth that spoke of too many years smiling through pain. I mean it, he said firmly. Stay, please. What about the arrangement? Room and board for work? We'll figure it out. Make it permanent. Make you a partner in the ranch if that's what it takes. A partner. Unless you want something else. The air between them felt charged with possibility and fear, and the weight of two people who'd been broken trying to figure out if they could build something whole together. I want to stay, Evelyn said quietly. I've wanted to stay for a while now, but I need you to understand something. I'm not here to replace what you lost. I can't be Margaret. I can only be myself, and some days that's not going to be enough. I don't want you to be Margaret. I just want you to be here, even when I'm difficult. Especially then, means you're being honest. She smiled, small and tentative, but real. Okay, then I'll stay. Relief hit him so hard his knees almost buckled. Okay, good. But if you change your mind, I won't. If you do, you have to tell me. Don't just let me keep living here while you resent me for it. Deal. They stood in the garden while the sun climbed higher and the day's heat began its assault. And something fundamental shifted between them. Not romance necessarily, though there was definitely that too, but a commitment, a choice to build something together instead of surviving alone. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt terrifying. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. Rowan was mending fence when he saw the rider approaching across the valley. Mail delivery was rare this far from town, usually meant someone had paid extra for express service. His stomach tightened with instinctive dread. The rider handed him a sealed envelope addressed to Evelyn Vale, care of the Mercer Ranch. The return address was Vermont. "She's inside," Rowan said, tipping the rider a coin. "I'll see she gets it." But he stood outside holding that envelope for a long time, and some dark part of him wanted to burn it. Wanted to protect her from whatever news had traveled across the country to find her. Wanted to pretend the past stayed buried where they'd left it. He carried it inside and found her washing dishes. "You got mail," he said, setting it on the table. Evelyn turned, saw the envelope, and went pale. Her hands were still wet and soapy when she picked it up, leaving dark spots on the paper. "It's from my sister," she said quietly, staring at the handwriting like it might bite her. "You don't have to read it if you don't want to." "Yes, I do." But she didn't open it immediately, just stood there holding it like something venomous. She was the only one who defended me, after James died. Everyone else believed his family, but Sarah, she tried to stand up for me. We fought about it before I left. Haven't spoken since. Maybe she's writing to apologize. Maybe. But the tone of her voice said she didn't believe it. She opened the envelope with shaking hands and pulled out 2 pages of neat handwriting. Rowan watched her face as she read, saw the color drain from her cheeks, saw her jaw tighten, saw something break behind her eyes. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer, just kept reading, her breathing getting shallower with each line. When she finished, she carefully folded the letter back into the envelope and set it on the table with the kind of precision people use when they're trying very hard not to fall apart. "They put up a gravestone," she said finally. Her voice sounded hollow. "James's family. Marble. Expensive. With an epitaph that says, 'Taken before his time by fate's cruel distraction.'" "That's..." Rowan searched for words. "That's a gravestone?" "Everyone knows what it means. Fate's cruel distraction. Me. I'm the distraction." She laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Sarah says the whole town's talking about it, using it as proof I killed him. Even people who defended me before are changing their minds. They're harassing her now, telling her she's cursed by association. They're idiots. They're my family. My town. My whole life before this." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "And they've turned my dead husband's grave into a billboard, announcing that I destroy everything I touch. You know that's not true. Do I?" She looked at him with eyes full of pain he couldn't fix. "What if they're right, Rowan? What if I am cursed? What if staying here means eventually you'll die too, and everyone will put up another stone blaming me for it? That's not how the world works, isn't it? James died because I made him late. I came here and the drought got worse. I stay and..." "Stop." He moved around the table, took her shoulders gently. "Listen to me. Your husband died because a mine collapsed. That's physics and cheap timber, not curses. The drought got worse because that's what droughts do, and staying here means the ranch has a chance at something better than slow decay. None of that is your fault. You don't know that." "Yes, I do. Because I spent 11 years blaming myself for deaths that weren't my fault either, and all it did was waste time I could have spent living." She pulled away from him, wrapping her arms around herself like she was trying to hold the pieces together. "Maybe I should leave. Go somewhere else before I ruin this too." "You're not ruining anything. Not yet. But I will. I always do." She picked up the letter. "I should have known better than to think I could escape it. Should have stayed in Vermont and accepted that some people don't get to be happy. Evelyn, I need to be alone right now." She walked out before he could stop her, heading toward the back of the property where the land stretched empty and unforgiving. Rowan stood in the kitchen holding her pain like a weight in his chest and feeling completely useless. He gave her an hour before going to find her. She was sitting on a rock outcropping overlooking the valley, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. "You came to make sure I didn't run," she said without looking at him. "No, I came to sit with you while you hurt. I don't need company." "I know, I'm staying anyway." He sat beside her on the hot stone, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they watched the desert shimmer in the afternoon heat, while the silence stretched between them. "Tell me about Margaret," Evelyn said suddenly. What? Your wife. Tell me something you never told anyone else. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, trying to figure out where she was going with this. She snored, he said finally, like a freight train. Kept me awake half the nights we were married. I used to get so annoyed, lie there counting ceiling beams and cursing under my breath. He smiled sadly. After she died, I couldn't sleep for months because the silence was worse. Would have given anything to hear that snoring again. She wasn't perfect, not even close. She was stubborn and opinionated and had a temper that could peel paint. We fought constantly. There were days I wanted to throttle her. But you loved her. Yeah, I did. And when she died, did people blame you? Some did. Said I should have gotten her to town sooner. Should have had a doctor on standby. Should have known something was wrong. The old guilt tried to rise up but felt weaker than before. I blamed myself worse than any of them. But you weren't cursed. No. Then why am I? It was the question at the heart of everything. Why did some people get to move on from grief while others got buried under it? Why did some deaths become tragic accidents while others became proof of divine punishment? You're not, Rowan said firmly. You're just human. Humans make choices, and sometimes those choices put people in the wrong place at the wrong time, and terrible things happen. But that's not a curse. That's just life being brutal and random and completely unfair. Then why does it feel like I'm poison? Because grief makes us believe the worst things about ourselves. And people who are scared of their own pain will blame yours before they look at their own. He took her hand, rough calluses against rough calluses. But I see you, Evelyn. I see what you've built here. How you've fought to keep this place alive when it should have died years ago. How you fought to keep me alive when I'd given up trying. That's not a curse. That's someone who refuses to quit even when the world gives them every reason to. She was crying now, silent tears tracking through the dust on her face. I'm so tired of fighting. I know. I just want to rest, want to stop looking over my shoulder waiting for the next disaster. Then rest, right here. Let someone else hold the weight for a while. She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders while she cried into his shirt. They sat on that rock until the sun started dropping toward the mesas, and the heat began its slow retreat into evening cool. I'm staying, she said finally, her voice muffled against his chest. I'm not letting those bastards in Vermont chase me off. Good. But if something happens to you, then it happens. And it won't be your fault any more than Margaret's death was mine. She pulled back to look at him. You really believe that? I'm trying to. That's not very reassuring. It's honest. He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. We're both a mess, Evelyn. Both broken in ways that don't heal right. But maybe that's okay. Maybe two broken people can build something that works better than what they had before. Or maybe we'll just break each other worse. Maybe, but I'd rather risk it than go back to being alone. She searched his face like she was looking for proof this wasn't another lie the world would use against her later. Whatever she found there must have been enough because she nodded slowly. Okay, we try. Together. They walked back to the ranch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The house waited for them, with lamplight glowing warm in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. It looked like what it had become, a place where two people were learning to live again despite every reason not to. That night they sat on the porch after supper, and Rowan pulled out the letter Evelyn had left on the kitchen table. What are you doing? She asked, getting rid of the past. He struck a match and held it to the corner of the paper. They watched it burn, orange flames consuming words meant to hurt, turning cruelty into ash. Won't change what they think, Evelyn said. Don't care what they think, only care what we know. He let the burning paper fall to the dirt and stomped it out. You're not cursed, you're here, and that's all that matters. She took his hand and held it, and they sat under the stars while the desert night wrapped around them, and somewhere far away in Vermont a gravestone stood with words that didn't matter anymore. The ashes from the burned letter stayed in the dirt for 3 days before rain finally washed them away. Not the violent storms Evelyn feared, just a steady drizzle that fell through the night and left everything smelling like wet earth and possibility. Rowan woke to the sound of it drumming on the roof and found Evelyn's side of the porch empty. He'd gotten used to finding her there in the mornings, watching the sun come up with a cup of coffee in her hands. The absence felt wrong. He found her in the garden, standing in the rain with her face tilted up and her arms spread wide. But she wasn't laughing this time. She was just standing there, letting the water soak through her nightgown, her expression somewhere between grief and relief. "You're going to catch pneumonia," he called from the porch. "Don't care." But she walked back toward the house, water dripping from her hair and clothes. "It's washing away the ashes. Felt like I should be out there when it happened." Symbolic? Something like that. She changed into dry clothes while he made breakfast, and they ate in comfortable silence while rain continued its patient work outside. The garden would drink deep today. The cistern would fill. The cattle would have standing water in the low places. Small mercies that meant survival for another few weeks. "I need to go into town," Evelyn said, pushing her empty plate aside. "We're low on supplies, and I want to send a letter to my sister." "Saying what?" "That I'm staying. That she can tell the whole town I'm cursed if she wants, but I'm not running anymore." She met his eyes. "That I found something worth staying for." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them was quite ready to unpack completely. "I'll hitch the wagon," Rowan said. They made the trip together, which surprised both of them. Rowan usually avoided town except when absolutely necessary, preferring to send orders with traveling merchants or do without, rather than face the stares and whispered conversations of people who remembered what he used to be. But today he climbed onto the wagon seat beside Evelyn like it was the most natural thing in the world. The town hadn't changed much in the months since Rowan's last visit. Still the same dusty main street, still the same handful of buildings squatting under the merciless sun, still the same people going about their business with the grim determination of folks who'd chosen to live in a place that actively tried to kill them. But something had changed in how people looked at him, at them. They pulled up to the general store, and Mrs. Patterson, the owner's wife, actually smiled when she saw them. "Well now, Mr. Mercer, and this must be the woman who's got your ranch looking alive again." "Evelyn Vale," Evelyn said, extending her hand. "Pleased to meet you." "Rachel Patterson. Heard you were out there working miracles. My husband rode past last week and said the place looks better than it has in a decade." "Hardly miracles, just work." "Don't let her fool you," Rowan said before he could stop himself. "She's been working miracles." Evelyn shot him a look that was part surprise, part warning, but he saw the small smile tugging at her lips. They bought supplies while Mrs. Patterson kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking about the ranch, the garden, the cattle, filling the silence with the kind of neighborly interest Rowan had forgotten existed. Other people wandered through the store, and each one stopped to say hello, to welcome Evelyn, to ask Rowan how he was managing. It felt disturbingly normal, like he was part of the community again instead of the ghost who lived on its edges. "That wasn't so bad," Evelyn said as they loaded supplies into the wagon. "Give it time. Someone will say something stupid. You're such an optimist. I'm realistic." But he was smiling when he said it, and she saw. They were halfway through loading when Thomas Fletcher appeared. He was a rancher who lived 20 miles east, a man Rowan had known slightly before Margaret died and hadn't spoken to since. He was big, weather-beaten, with a beard that had gone completely gray and eyes that still held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd survived 40 years on the frontier. "Rowan Mercer," he said, walking over with his hand extended. "Been meaning to ride out your way." Rowan shook his hand warily. "That's so. Heard you got help out there now. Heard the ranch is coming back." He nodded at Evelyn. "Ma'am, Tom Fletcher." "Evelyn Vale. You're the one got the garden growing." "Among other things." "Well, I wanted to talk to you both about something." He glanced around the street, then lowered his voice. "There's been talk. Some of the ranchers were thinking about forming a cooperative, sharing resources during drought years, helping each other with big jobs, that kind of thing. We'd like you to consider joining." Rowan stared at him. "Why?" "Because you're good people trying to survive in a hard place, same as the rest of us." Fletcher shrugged. "And because we figure if Miss Vale here can bring your ranch back from the dead, she might have ideas that could help the rest of us too." Evelyn looked genuinely shocked. "I'm not an expert on anything. Maybe not. But you're making it work. That's expertise enough in my book." Fletcher tipped his hat. "Think about it. We're meeting next month at the Harrison Ranch. You're both welcome." He walked away before either of them could respond, leaving Rowan and Evelyn standing by the wagon trying to process what had just happened. Did he just... Evelyn started. Ask us to join a cooperative, yeah. People don't usually ask cursed women to help save their ranches. Told you that story was horseshit. She smiled, but he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Maybe Vermont was the anomaly. Maybe here I get to just be a person. You were always just a person. Some people are just too stupid to see it. They finished loading in silence, but something had shifted. The town that Rowan had been avoiding for years had welcomed them back without judgment, without whispered accusations, without the weight of past grief pressing down on every interaction. It felt fragile, like it might shatter if he examined it too closely. But it was there. On the ride home, Evelyn drafted her letter to Sarah in her head, speaking the words aloud to test how they sounded. Dear Sarah, I'm staying in Arizona. I found work on a ranch, and the people here don't care about gravestones or curses or what happened in Vermont. They care about whether you show up when you say you will, and whether you pull your weight. I know that's hard for you to understand, given everything back there, but it's the truth. I hope someday you can visit and see for yourself. Until then, take care of yourself and don't let anyone make you feel ashamed for being my sister. Love, Evelyn. That's good, Rowan said. You think she'll write back? Does it matter? Evelyn thought about that for a while, watching the desert roll past in its endless variations of brown and red and gold. No, I guess it doesn't. I said what I needed to say. Then that's enough. They were halfway home when they saw the smoke, not from their chimney, from somewhere beyond their property line, thick black smoke rising in a column that spoke of something bigger than a cooking fire gone wrong. That's the Henderson place, Rowan said, snapping the reins to push the horses faster. They've got 2 young kids. They covered the distance at a pace that made the wagon bounce dangerously, supplies shifting in the bed. As they got closer, they could see flames licking at what was left of a barn, and a woman standing in the yard with 2 children clutched against her skirts, all 3 of them crying, while a man threw bucket after bucket of water onto the fire with the desperate futility of someone who knew they'd already lost. Rowan jumped down before the wagon fully stopped. Tom, what happened? Tom Henderson turned, his face black with soot. Lightning strike, caught the hay, spread before we could stop it. The barn was beyond saving, that much was obvious, but the flames were throwing sparks toward the house, and if those caught, the family would lose everything. Evelyn, get the children to the wagon, Rowan shouted, already grabbing buckets. Mrs. Henderson, go with her. I can help, Evelyn said. The kids need someone who's not panicking. Go. She went, herding the terrified children and their mother away from the flames while Rowan and Tom formed a desperate bucket brigade. The well was 30 yards from the house. The fire was spreading fast, and there were only 2 of them against an inferno that had no interest in mercy. They worked until their arms felt like they'd been beaten with clubs, until their faces were burned from the heat, until their lungs were choked with smoke. Rowan lost track of time, lost track of everything except the next bucket, the next throw, the next desperate attempt to save something from the flames. At some point, Evelyn came back despite his orders and joined the line, passing buckets with a efficiency that doubled their speed. Then Mrs. Henderson came too, and the 4 of them fought together while the children sat in the wagon crying, and the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks that made the house roof start smoking. It's the roof, Tom shouted. We're going to lose it. Rowan looked at the house, at the family's entire life about to go up in flames, and something in him refused to accept it. He'd lost too much already. He wasn't watching another person lose everything if he could help it. I'm going up, he said. The hell you are, Evelyn grabbed his arm. That roof's not stable. Then it'll collapse with me on it, or without me. Either way, I'm trying. He grabbed a bucket and climbed the side of the house using the porch post, pulled himself onto the roof despite the heat coming through the shingles, and started dumping water on the smoking sections. Tom climbed up after him, and together they fought the flames that were trying to eat through the roof from below. The wood was hot enough to burn through boot leather. Smoke was so thick Rowan could barely see. But he kept moving, kept dumping water, kept refusing to let the fire win. Below, Evelyn and Mrs. Henderson kept passing buckets up with a speed born of desperation. And slowly, impossibly, the flames on the roof started to die. It took another hour to fully contain the fire. By the time it was over, the barn was gone, reduced to smoking rubble and charred timber. But the house stood. Damaged, smoke-stained, half the roof would need replacing, but it stood. The four of them collapsed in the yard, covered in soot and ash, breathing like they'd run a marathon. The children finally stopped crying and came over to their parents, and Mrs. Henderson pulled them close while Tom sat there staring at his destroyed barn with the hollow eyes of someone calculating how they'd survive the winter without it. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rough from smoke. "Without you two, we'd have lost everything." "You'd have done the same," Rowan said. "Would I? You didn't even know us. We've never spoken before today." "Doesn't matter. You needed help." Tom looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of friendship. "Cooperative meets next month. You should come. Both of you. People like you, people who show up when things get bad, that's what we need." They stayed long enough to help Tom salvage what he could from the barn wreckage and make sure the house was safe. By the time they climbed back on the wagon, the sun was setting and they were both so exhausted they could barely sit upright. "You could have died," Evelyn said as they started for home. "So could you. Told you to stay with the kids. And I told you I could help. We're partners, remember? That means we don't get to die stupidly without the other one there." He wanted to argue, but he was too tired and she was too right. They made it home as full dark settled over the desert. Rowan unhitched the horses while Evelyn carried supplies inside with the last dregs of her energy. They both needed baths, food, and about 12 hours of sleep, probably in that order. Instead, they stood in the kitchen and looked at each other, really looked, seeing past the soot and exhaustion to something that had crystallized during the fire. "I thought you were going to fall through that roof," Evelyn said quietly. "I thought the whole house was going to collapse with you standing under it." "We're a pair of idiots." "Yeah, we are." She crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around him, not caring that they were both filthy and probably getting soot all over each other. He held her back, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, solid and alive and real. "I can't lose you," she whispered into his shirt. "I know that's not fair to say, and I know we're not—" She pulled back to look at him. "But I can't. You're not going to. You don't know that." "No. But I'm going to try like hell to make sure of it anyway." He kissed her. Didn't plan it, didn't think about whether it was the right time or the right moment. Just leaned down and pressed his lips to hers because not doing it felt impossible. She kissed him back with an intensity that spoke of months of careful distance finally breaking down, of two people who'd been circling each other finally admitting what they'd known for a while now. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. "This is going to be complicated," she said. "Probably. We're both a mess. Definitely. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. But at least we tried." She kissed him again, softer this time, and it felt less like desperation and more like a promise. That they'd try. That they'd fight for this the way they'd fought the fire, stubborn and reckless and refusing to quit even when the odds were terrible. They cleaned up eventually, ate cold leftovers because neither had the energy to cook, and fell into bed in their separate rooms because some changes happened slowly even after everything else shifted. But Rowan lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about how her lips had felt against his, how right it had felt to hold her, how completely terrified he was that he'd found something worth having again. In the other room, Evelyn did the same thing, her fingers touching her lips, her heart doing something complicated in her chest that felt equal parts hope and fear. The next few weeks passed in a strange blur of routine and newness. They worked the ranch together the way they always had, but now there were stolen moments, hands brushing while passing tools, kisses in the garden when no one was around to see, sitting close on the porch at night instead of carefully maintaining distance. They didn't talk about what it meant, didn't define it or put labels on it or make plans beyond the next day. It felt too fragile for that, like examining it too closely would make it disappear. But the ranch responded to it anyway. The garden produced its first ripe tomatoes, fat and red and tasting like victory. The chickens laid enough eggs that they had extra to take to town. The cattle started gaining weight as the water situation stabilized. Even the house itself seemed different, like the walls were breathing again after years of holding their breath. Neighbors started stopping by more often. Tom Henderson came with his wife to deliver fresh milk as thanks. Rachel Patterson brought fabric for new curtains. Tom Fletcher rode over to talk about the cooperative, and ended up staying for supper, swapping stories about drought years and difficult cattle, while Evelyn served stew and bread like she'd been hosting ranch dinners her whole life. "You've built something special here," Fletcher said before he left. "Both of you. Don't take that for granted." "We won't," Rowan said, and meant it. But the frontier has a way of testing people right when they start believing things might work out, and it was about to test them harder than either could have imagined. The sky turned wrong 3 days before the storm hit. Rowan noticed it first during his morning check of the property. The color was off, a sickly greenish gray that made his skin prickle with instinctive dread. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on the earth. "Storm coming," he told Evelyn at breakfast. "Bad one." "How bad?" "Bad enough that sky looks like that." They spent the day preparing, secured everything that could blow away, brought the chickens into a reinforced coop, moved the horses to the barn, filled every container they had with water. By evening, the wind had picked up, hot and gusty, carrying dust that stung exposed skin. "Maybe it'll pass us," Evelyn said, but she didn't sound convinced. It didn't pass. The storm hit at sunset with a violence that felt personal, wind that screamed like something alive, rain that fell sideways in sheets, lightning that cracked so close it left the taste of copper in the air. And underneath it all, a sound Rowan had only heard twice in his life, the low, rumbling roar of a tornado forming. "Cellar!" he shouted over the wind. "Now!" The storm cellar was behind the house, a dugout space carved into the earth with a heavy wooden door. They ran for it through rain that felt like being hit with fists, fighting wind that tried to pull them off their feet. Rowan got the door open and practically threw Evelyn down the stairs before following and slamming it shut behind them. The darkness was absolute. He fumbled for the lamp they kept down there, got it lit with shaking hands, and in the flickering light saw Evelyn pressed against the far wall with her eyes wide and her breathing coming too fast. "It's okay," he said, moving toward her. "We're safe down here." "We're underground," she gasped. "We're buried." Oh, hell. He'd forgotten about her husband's grave, about the mud and water, and her standing there watching while the earth swallowed him. "Evelyn, look at me." He took her face in his hands. "We're not buried. We're protected. This cellar has saved people through a dozen storms. It's going to save us through this one." "I can't breathe." "Yes, you can. You're breathing right now, in and out. Feel that?" Above them, the storm raged with apocalyptic fury. The whole cellar shook, dirt rained down from the ceiling. Something massive crashed overhead, probably part of the barn or the house, and Evelyn flinched so hard she nearly knocked the lamp over. "I need to get out," she said, trying to push past him toward the stairs. "Can't do that. Not until it passes." "I can't stay here. I can't." "Then I'll stay with you. Right here. Not going anywhere." He pulled her against his chest, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand stroking her hair. "Tell me about Vermont. Tell me about the green." "What?" "You said everything was green. Tell me about it. Distract yourself." I can't think." "Try. For me." What did it look like in spring? She was shaking against him, her fingers digging into his shirt, but she tried. "Trees. Maple trees. They'd get these little red buds before the leaves came out." "What else?" "Moss, on the north side of rocks and tree trunks, so green it almost hurt to look at." "Good. Keep going." Above them, the storm shrieked and tore and destroyed. But Rowan kept her talking, kept her anchored to memories instead of fear, kept her breathing through the panic that wanted to drown her. He told her about Margaret, about Thomas, about every memory he'd been carrying alone for 11 years. About the good times before the tragedy, about learning to farm when he'd always been better with cattle, about the first year of marriage when everything was hard and they'd fought constantly but somehow made it work anyway. "She would have liked you," he said at one point. "You don't know that." "I do. She would have appreciated how you don't take my crap, how you push back when I get too deep in my own head." He kissed the top of her head. "She would have been glad I found someone who didn't let me rot." "I'm not her replacement." "I know. You're your own person. That's why it works." They sat in that cellar for 3 hours while the tornado ripped their world apart overhead. Evelyn's panic came in waves, and each time Rowan talked her through it, holding her steady while the earth tried to swallow them both. When the storm finally passed, When the terrible roaring stopped and the silence felt almost as violent, Rowan carefully opened the cellar door and looked out at what remained. The devastation was total. The barn was gone. Just gone. A pile of splintered wood and twisted metal where it used to stand. The house had lost half its roof and one entire wall. The chicken coop had been reduced to kindling. The garden was torn from the earth, plants and soil scattered across the valley like confetti. Fences lay in broken pieces. The wagon had flipped over and smashed against the remains of the house. Everything they'd built together over the last 5 months was destroyed. Rowan stood in the doorway staring at the wreckage, feeling something break inside his chest that he'd thought was already broken beyond repair. They'd fought so hard, worked so long, built something real from nothing, and the frontier had taken it away in 3 hours. Behind him, Evelyn climbed the stairs and stopped when she saw the destruction. He heard her sharp intake of breath, waited for the despair, the resignation, the inevitable moment when she'd realized this place was cursed after all, and she'd been right to think she destroyed everything she touched. Instead, she walked past him into the ruins. She picked her way through scattered debris, stepping carefully over broken boards and shattered glass. Rowan watched her bend down near what used to be the garden, digging through mud and wreckage with her bare hands. "Evelyn, what are you—" She stood up holding something green, a tomato plant, broken and muddy, but with roots still attached and one piece of stem still clinging to life. "Then we plant it again," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were clear. She stood in the middle of total destruction, holding a broken plant like it was a flag she refused to let fall. "Everything's gone," Rowan said. "The barn, the house, the garden, everything we built." "Then we build it again." "You don't understand. This is going to take months, years maybe. We'd have to start completely over." "I know. We might not make it through the winter without the barn. Might lose the cattle. Might lose everything." "I know. Then why—" "Because I'm not running." She walked over to him with that broken plant clutched in her hands like a promise. "I'm not letting a storm chase me away any more than I let Vermont do it. This is my home now, our home, and we're going to fix it." Rowan looked at her standing in the ruins of their life, covered in mud, holding a plant that should have died, refusing to accept defeat even when any rational person would have walked away. And he fell in love with her completely. Not the tentative feelings he'd been nursing for months, not the careful attraction he'd been trying to manage. Full, reckless, terrifying love that made him want to rebuild everything twice as strong just to prove they could. "Okay," he said. "We plant it again." She smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in the middle of all that destruction. They spent the rest of the day salvaging what they could, found 3 more plants still alive, found some tools that had survived, found their bed frames intact even though the roof above them was gone, found the stove still standing in what used to be the kitchen. Small victories that meant survival was still possible. As the sun set over the devastated ranch, they stood side by side, surveying the work ahead of them. And Rowan felt something he hadn't felt in 11 years. Not just hope, determination. They were going to rebuild, together. And this time they'd make it strong enough to survive anything the frontier threw at them, because they'd already survived the worst it had to offer. Everything after this was just work. They slept under the stars that first night because there was no roof left to sleep under. Rowan dragged their mattresses out into the yard, away from anything that might collapse further, and they lay there wrapped in blankets while the desert sky wheeled overhead in all its indifferent beauty. "You awake?" Evelyn asked, sometime after midnight. "Yeah." "What are you thinking about?" "How much lumber we're going to need, how long it'll take, whether we can get it done before winter." He paused. "Whether I can ask you to go through all that work when you could just leave and find something easier." She rolled onto her side to face him. In the starlight, her face was all shadows and sharp angles. "You're not asking me to do anything. I already decided." Deciding and doing are different things. Once we start rebuilding, once you see how hard it's going to be. I grew up in Vermont winters, Rowan. I know hard. This doesn't scare me. It should. It scares me. Good. Means you're not stupid. She reached across the space between their mattresses and found his hand. "We'll figure it out, together." He held her hand and stared at the stars and tried to believe her. Tried to quiet the voice in his head that said this was too much. that they'd never recover, that he should cut his losses now before losing even more. But her hand in his felt solid and real, and the broken tomato plant she'd replanted in a bucket near their makeshift bed was still alive, despite everything. Maybe that was enough to build on. Dawn came with the kind of clear, brutal sunlight that made the destruction look even worse. In daylight, they could see details they'd missed in the dark. Personal belongings scattered across the valley, clothes hanging from cactus spines half a mile away, a photograph of Margaret face down in the mud near what used to be the porch. Rowan picked it up carefully, wiped the mud away with his shirt. Margaret stared back at him, young and alive and frozen in a moment that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. "You should keep that," Evelyn said quietly behind him. "I know. I mean it. I'm not asking you to forget her. I'm not forgetting her, I'm just—" He looked at the photo, then at Evelyn, then at the ruins of the house where Margaret had died. "I'm just trying to figure out how to live with all of it. The past and the present, the dead and the living. You don't have to figure it out right now. Feels like I should have it figured out by now. Been 11 years. Grief doesn't have a schedule." She took the photo from him gently and looked at it. "She's pretty. Looks tough." She was. "I can see why you loved her." Evelyn handed it back. "Keep it somewhere safe. When we rebuild the house, we'll make sure there's a place for her picture." The casualness of it, the assumption that Margaret's memory would have a place in whatever they built together, loosened something in Rowan's chest that had been tied tight for years. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not making me choose. Between then and now. Between her and you. That's not how it works. You're allowed to love someone who died and someone who's still here. Heart's bigger than people think." She squeezed his arm and walked toward the wreckage. "Come on, we've got work to do." They spent the morning taking inventory. The stove had survived. Most of the tools were scattered but intact. The well was still producing water. The horses had weathered the storm in the barn before it collapsed, and somehow emerged with just scratches. 2 cattle were dead, the rest scattered across the range but alive. The chickens were gone, probably blown halfway to Mexico. By noon they'd assembled a pile of salvageable materials that looked pathetically small against the scale of what needed rebuilding. "We need help," Evelyn said, surveying their meager resources. "We can't do this alone." "I know, but asking for help means admitting we can't handle it ourselves." "So? We can't handle it ourselves? That's not a character flaw, that's just mathematics." She wiped sweat from her forehead. "Didn't Tom Fletcher say something about a cooperative? People helping each other?" "He did." "Then let's ride over there tomorrow and ask." Pride wanted him to refuse. Wanted to insist they'd manage somehow, that he didn't need charity, that accepting help meant admitting weakness. But pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore, not with winter coming and half a house and no barn. "Okay," he said. "We'll ask." They rode to Tom Fletcher's place the next morning, Rowan on horseback, and Evelyn on the remaining horse since the wagon was destroyed. The 20-mile trip gave them plenty of time to rehearse what they'd say, how they'd ask without sounding desperate, even though they absolutely were. Fletcher was in his north pasture mending fence when they arrived. He took one look at them and set down his tools. "The storm hit you hard," he said. It wasn't a question. "Lost the barn, most of the house. The garden." Rowan kept his voice level. "We're rebuilding, but we need help. Lumber, labor, whatever people can spare. I can pay back—" "Stop!" Fletcher held up a hand. "This is what the cooperative is for. You don't pay back. You pay forward when someone else needs help." "I don't take charity." "Good, because I'm not offering any. I'm offering community. Different thing." Fletcher looked at Evelyn. "How bad is it really?" She didn't sugarcoat it. "Bad enough that we're sleeping outside. Bad enough that we'll freeze come winter without a proper roof. Bad enough that we can't do it alone no matter how much pride we try to swallow." Fletcher nodded slowly. "I'll put out word. We can have a crew at your place day after tomorrow. Bring what lumber we've got. You'll need to buy more, but we can get you started." "Why?" Rowan asked. "Why help us? You barely know us." "Because you climbed on Tom Henderson's roof during a fire. Because you've worked hard to bring that ranch back even when everyone thought it was dead. And because out here, we take care of our own, or we all die separately." Fletcher extended his hand. "Day after tomorrow, sunrise." Be ready to work." They shook on it, and Rowan felt something shift in his understanding of what survival meant on the frontier. It wasn't just individual strength or stubborn determination. It was knowing when to ask for help and having people who'd answer. The crew arrived before dawn 2 days later. Not just Tom Fletcher, but 8 other ranchers and their families, showing up with wagons full of lumber, tools, food, and the kind of organized efficiency that spoke of people who'd done this before. Rachel Patterson took charge of the women, setting up a cooking station and organizing supplies while her husband and the other men started clearing debris. Tom Henderson arrived with his sons, all of them still bearing burn scars from the fire, but ready to work anyway. Even people Rowan didn't recognize showed up, neighbors from so far out he'd never met them. "Where do you want to start?" Fletcher asked. Rowan looked at Evelyn. She looked at the destruction. Then she pointed at the house. "Roof first, then walls. Then we worry about the barn." "Smart woman," Fletcher said approvingly. "Can't rebuild anything if you freeze to death first." The work began. It was brutal, back-breaking labor under the same merciless sun that had watched the storm destroy everything. But there was something almost beautiful about it too. The sound of hammers and saws, the way people moved together with practiced coordination, the casual conversations and shared water breaks and moments of laughter when someone made a joke to break the tension. Rowan found himself working alongside men he had avoided for years, and they treated him like he'd never left the community. Asked about the cattle, shared advice about drought management, included him in conversations about territorial politics and weather patterns and the price of beef in Tucson. Evelyn worked with the women, and Rowan watched her bloom under their acceptance. They didn't treat her like an outsider or ask invasive questions about where she came from. They just handed her tasks and expected her to complete them, which she did with the same stubborn competence she brought to everything. By the end of the first day, they had roof beams in place. By the end of the second, there was actual roofing covering most of the house. By the end of the third, walls were going up, and the structure was starting to look like a home again instead of wreckage. On the 4th evening, after the work crews had left and Rowan and Evelyn were alone surveying the progress, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. "They're not just helping us rebuild the house," she said quietly. "They're giving us back our lives." "I know. I've never had this. Community that shows up without being asked, people who care without expecting something back. Neither have I. Not for a long time." He put his arm around her shoulders. "But we've got it now." She leaned against him, and they watched the sun set over their half-rebuilt house. And for the first time since the storm, Rowan let himself believe they might actually make it through this. The barn went up slower because lumber was expensive and they had to buy most of it themselves. Rowan sold 2 steers to raise cash, and Evelyn contributed what was left of her savings without being asked. It hurt to spend money they didn't have on a building that had been standing fine before nature decided to knock it down. But necessity didn't care about hurt feelings. Fletcher and his crew came back on weekends to help with the heavy lifting. During the week, Rowan and Evelyn worked alone, fitting boards and raising walls and learning construction through trial and error and occasional spectacular failures. "This is crooked," Evelyn said one afternoon, eyeing a wall that was definitely not perpendicular to anything. "It's fine. It's leaning. Buildings lean, that's normal. Not this much they don't. It'll hold. It'll fall over the next strong wind and we'll have to rebuild it again." They argued about it for 20 minutes before admitting she was right and tearing the whole section down to start over. It became a pattern: build something wrong, argue about it, fix it, move on. Frustrating and exhausting, and somehow exactly what they needed. Because working together, solving problems together, building something permanent together, it solidified what was between them in ways that words couldn't. They were partners now in every sense that mattered, equal contributors to something bigger than either of them alone. One evening in late October, after a particularly long day of construction, they finally had walls and a roof on the barn. It wasn't pretty, would never be confused with fine carpentry, but it was solid and square and would keep the animals safe through winter. "We did it," Evelyn said, standing in the empty barn and looking at the space they'd created from destruction. Most of it anyway. Still needs stalls built, doors hung, loft floor reinforced. But the structure's done. The rest is just details. Rowan looked at her standing in the middle of their barn, covered in sawdust and sweat, smiling like they'd accomplished something impossible. Which they had. They'd taken total devastation and turned it back into something functional. Not perfect, not what it was before, but maybe better because they'd built it together. "Marry me," he said. The words came out before he could stop them, before he could second guess or talk himself out of it. Just a plain statement of what he wanted, offered without ceremony or planning in the middle of an unfinished barn. Evelyn stared at him. "What?" "Marry me. For real this time. Not because an agency said so or because we made some temporary arrangement. Because I want you here permanently. Because I love you, and I'm tired of pretending this is temporary when we both know it's not." "You love me." "Yeah." "Since when?" "Since you held that broken plant and said we'd replant it. Maybe before that, I don't know. Does it matter?" She was quiet for a long moment, and Rowan felt panic start to creep in. Maybe he'd misread everything. Maybe she wanted to stay but didn't want marriage. Maybe he'd just ruined everything by pushing too hard too fast. "I'm a mess," she said finally. "I'm scared of storms, and I think I'm cursed, and I have panic attacks in enclosed spaces. I'm difficult and stubborn, and I don't always make sense." "I know. And you still want to marry me?" "Especially because of all that. You're a mess, and I'm a mess, and somehow we work together anyway." He moved closer. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to stay, officially, permanently, as my wife. I don't have a dowry, or family to invite, or anything to bring to a marriage except work and whatever feelings I've got for you. That's all I want." "You're serious?" As a heart attack, she laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed in the empty barn. "This is the worst proposal I've ever heard. No ring, no romance, not even a sunset, just you blurting it out in an unfinished barn like you're asking me to pass the hammer. Is that a no?" "It's a yes, you idiot. Of course it's a yes." He crossed the space between them and kissed her hard, lifting her off her feet while she laughed against his mouth. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools, covered in sawdust, standing in a barn they'd built from ruins, promising each other a future neither of them had thought possible 6 months ago. "We should probably tell people," Evelyn said. "Probably, but not tonight. Tonight I just want it to be us. Scared people will talk you out of it? Scared I'll wake up and realize I imagined the whole thing." She kissed him again, slower this time, not imagining it. "I'm really here, really saying yes, really staying." They walked back to the house holding hands while stars came out overhead and the desert settled into its evening cool. The house looked better now with its new roof and reinforced walls. Not the same as before, but solid, permanent, a place that could survive whatever came next. That night they pushed their mattresses together in the bedroom that finally had 4 walls and a ceiling again. They made love for the first time with a tenderness that surprised them both. 2 broken people careful with each other's wounds while learning how to be whole together. Afterward, lying in the dark with Evelyn's head on his chest and her hand over his heart, Rowan felt something he'd thought died with Margaret. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the ability to hold pain and hope simultaneously, to remember the past without being destroyed by it, to build a future without betraying what came before. "Tell me about the wedding you want," he said into the darkness. "I don't need anything fancy, just something simple, maybe at the ranch with whoever wants to come. Rachel Patterson will want to organize it. Probably, she strikes me as the organizing type. Tom Fletcher will want to make a speech. We might need to set a time limit on that." They talked until sleep took them, planning a wedding that would be nothing like what either had imagined their lives would include. No church, no elaborate ceremony, no pretense of perfection. Just 2 people who'd survived the worst the frontier could throw at them, standing together and promising to keep surviving. News spread fast in ranching country. By the end of the week, everyone within 50 miles knew about the upcoming wedding. Rachel Patterson showed up the next morning with fabric samples and strong opinions about decorations. "Nothing too fancy," Evelyn said, looking overwhelmed by the options. "I mean it, Rachel. This isn't that kind of wedding. Every wedding deserves some beauty, even practical ones." Rachel held up a piece of white lace. "What about this for the tables? We don't have tables. We'll bring tables." "Rachel, you're getting married after rebuilding from a tornado, Evelyn. People want to celebrate that. Let them." In the end, Evelyn gave up trying to keep it simple and let Rachel's enthusiasm carry the planning forward, which was fine because there was still a barn to finish and a garden to replant and a ranch to run, and Rowan needed her focused on things she was actually good at. "You're avoiding the planning," she accused him one evening. "I'm working. You're hiding in the barn. Can it be both?" She threw a towel at him. "You proposed. You don't get to hide from the consequences." "I'm not hiding. I'm just giving you space to make it what you want. What I want is for you to care about this. I do care. I care that we're getting married. I don't care about decorations or seating arrangements or what color anything is. Those things matter. To you, to Rachel, not to me." He set down his tools and walked over to her. "I care about you, about us, about making this official. The rest is just," he gestured vaguely, "extra." She sighed but smiled. "You're impossible. You're the one who said yes." "Still time to change my mind." "No, there isn't." He kissed her to prove his point, and she kissed him back. And the wedding planning got delayed another hour while they reminded each other why they were doing this in the first place. The date was set for the second Saturday in November, early enough to beat the worst of winter, late enough to finish the critical construction. 3 weeks to prepare, which Rachel insisted was barely enough time but would have to do. Rowan used those weeks to finish the barn, build proper stalls, hang doors, and create something he could be proud to show people who'd be coming to the ranch. Evelyn replanted the garden with fall crops, organized the house, and tried not to panic about standing in front of people promising forever when her track record with forever was catastrophically bad. "You're overthinking it," Rowan told her the night before the wedding. "Of course I'm overthinking it. That's what I do. We're already doing this. The wedding is just making it official." Official means permanent. Permanent means there's more to lose. There's always more to lose. That's how caring works. He pulled her close. "But we're going to do it anyway because the alternative is spending our lives protecting ourselves from pain by never risking anything. And that's not living. That's just slow dying." "When did you get so wise?" "Around the time you showed up and started fixing things." She rested her forehead against his chest. "I'm terrified." "Me too." "But we're doing it anyway." "Yeah, we are." The wedding day dawned clear and cool, perfect weather after weeks of heat. People started arriving mid-morning, ranchers and their families coming from distances that required overnight travel. They set up camps in the valley near the ranch, turning the empty desert into a temporary community. Rachel and the other women had transformed the property. White fabric draped from posts around the rebuilt porch. Tables appeared from nowhere, covered in more food than Rowan had seen in years. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought whiskey. Fletcher brought a preacher he'd convinced to ride out from town. Evelyn got ready in the bedroom while the women fussed over her dress. Nothing fancy, just a simple blue dress Rachel had altered to fit better. And her hair, and assuring her this was normal pre-wedding panic and she'd be fine. Rowan stood on the porch in his best shirt and cleanest pants, watching people gather, and tried to remember how to breathe. "You good?" Fletcher asked, appearing beside him with 2 glasses of whiskey. "No. Good." "Means you're taking it seriously." Fletcher handed him a glass. "To new beginnings, and the stubborn fools brave enough to try them." They drank, and the whiskey burned warm down Rowan's throat, and he felt slightly less like he might pass out. The ceremony was short because the preacher was practical and understood frontier people had work to get back to. They gathered in front of the house, under the porch where Rowan had carved both their names above the door. Evelyn emerged looking nervous and beautiful and absolutely terrified, and Rowan felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. She walked toward him without anyone giving her away because she didn't belong to anyone except herself. When she reached him and took his hands, hers were shaking. "Still time to run," he whispered. "Not a chance." The preacher said words about commitment and partnership and building lives together. Asked them to repeat vows that promised presence and honesty and working through whatever came next. Rowan said them and meant every word. Evelyn said them with tears in her eyes, but her voice steady. When the preacher pronounced them married, Rowan kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, and the assembled crowd cheered like they'd accomplished something worth celebrating. Because they had. 2 broken people had chosen each other despite every reason not to. Had rebuilt not just a ranch but themselves. Had proven that starting over was possible even after losing everything. The celebration lasted into the evening. Food and music and dancing under stars that had witnessed so much pain on this property and were now seeing joy instead. Rowan danced with Evelyn, both of them terrible at it, both of them laughing while they stumbled through steps neither had practiced. "We did it," she said, pressed close against him while the fiddle played something sweet and slow. "Yeah, we did. I'm your wife now." "You were my wife in everything but name for months. This just makes it official." Official feels different, feels real. It is real. All of it. The ranch, the rebuild, us. It's all real. She looked up at him with eyes that held less fear than before, less doubt, more certainty that this might actually work. "I love you," she said. "I know I haven't said it enough, but I do. I love you and I'm staying and I'm not running no matter what comes next." "Good, because I'm not letting you go." They danced until the music stopped and people started heading to their camps for the night. Fletcher was the last to leave, pausing to shake Rowan's hand one final time. "You built something good here," he said. "Both of you. Don't take it for granted." "We won't. And when things get hard, because they will get hard, remember you've got people now, community. Don't try to handle everything alone." "We won't," Evelyn promised. After everyone left, Rowan and Evelyn stood on their porch and looked at their ranch by moonlight. The new barn, the rebuilt house, the replanted garden. The two names carved above the door. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what either of them had planned for their lives. But it was theirs, built from ruins, earned through work and stubbornness and refusing to quit even when quitting would have been easier. "Welcome home, Mrs. Mercer," Rowan said. Evelyn smiled and took his hand. "Been home for a while now. This just makes it official." They went inside together, closing the door on the night and the past and everything that had tried to break them, ready to face whatever came next as long as they faced it together. Winter came early that year, arriving in November with cold winds that swept down from the northern mountains and turned the desert into something almost unrecognizable. The first snow fell 3 weeks after the wedding, light dustings that melted by noon but signaled harder weather ahead. Rowan woke that morning to find Evelyn already up, standing at the window watching white flakes drift past like lost fragments of cloud. She had her arms wrapped around herself, and even from across the room he could see the tension in her shoulders. "First snow," he said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I know what it is." "You okay?" She leaned back against him but didn't answer immediately. Outside, the world was transforming into something softer, quieter, the harsh edges of the desert smoothed under a blanket of white. "Takes me back to Vermont," she said finally, "to the last winter before James died. We had snow like this for months, beautiful and suffocating at the same time. You want to talk about it?" "No, I want to stop letting the past ruin every good moment." She turned in his arms to face him. "I'm married to you, living in Arizona, building a new life, and I need to let Vermont stay in Vermont." "Easier said than done." "Everything worth doing is." She kissed him quickly. "Come on. Cattle need checking, and I'm not spending my first snow as Mrs. Mercer standing around being melancholy." They worked through the morning, checking animals, securing feed, making sure everything was ready for whatever winter decided to throw at them. The snow kept falling, light but persistent, and by afternoon the ranch looked like something from a different world. The garden plot Evelyn had replanted stood empty now, the fall crops harvested and stored, the soil resting until spring. But she'd already started planning next year's planting, sketching layouts and crop rotations in a notebook she kept by her bedside. Always thinking ahead, always building toward a future she was finally letting herself believe in. That evening, they rode into town for supplies before the roads became impassable. The trip took longer than usual, the horses picking their way carefully through snow that was starting to accumulate in earnest. But they made it by late afternoon and found the general store bustling with other ranchers doing the same last-minute preparation. "Evelyn, Rowan," Rachel Patterson waved them over with the enthusiasm of someone who'd adopted them as special projects. "How's married life treating you?" "Still married," Rowan said, "so I guess it's working." "That's the spirit. Keep those expectations low." Rachel laughed and turned to Evelyn. "I've been meaning to tell you, there's a women's auxiliary forming. We meet once a month, work on projects for the community. You should join." "I'm not much of a joiner." Neither was I until I realized being stubborn and isolated just means you suffer alone when things go wrong. Come to one meeting. If you hate it, you never have to come back. Evelyn looked at Rowan, who shrugged. Your choice. Fine, one meeting. Excellent. Next one's at my place, second Tuesday in December. Rachel squeezed her arm. You're one of us now. Might as well act like it. As they loaded supplies into the wagon, Tom Henderson rode up looking troubled. You two headed back to your place? He asked. Planning on it. Why? Storm's coming in harder than expected. Weather watcher in Tucson says it's going to be bad. Real bad. You might want to consider staying in town tonight. Rowan looked at the sky, which had gone from light gray to something darker and more threatening while they'd been shopping. The wind was picking up, carrying snow in horizontal sheets now instead of gentle drifts. How bad? Evelyn asked. Bad enough the watcher said people should shelter in place, not travel. Henderson shifted in his saddle. My place is closer than town. You're welcome to stay there tonight if you'd rather head out. The smart move was to accept. The ranch would survive one night without them. The animals were secured, the house was locked up, and traveling in a storm that had professionals worried was asking for trouble. But Rowan looked at Evelyn and saw the same stubborn refusal to be driven away from their home that he felt in his own chest. We'll risk it, he said. Thanks for the offer, though. Your funeral. Henderson tipped his hat. Be careful out there. They made it halfway home before the storm hit with full force. The snow went from steady to blinding in minutes, wind-driven flakes that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature dropped so fast Rowan could feel it through his coat. The horses struggled, heads down, fighting through drifts that were growing deeper by the minute. This was stupid, Evelyn shouted over the wind. We should have stayed in town. Too late now. Just keep moving. But keeping moving became harder with each passing minute. The road disappeared under snow. Landmarks vanished in white chaos. Rowan tried to navigate by memory and instinct, but the storm disoriented everything. After an hour, they could have been anywhere, still on the road, miles off course, heading in completely the wrong direction. The wagon hit something hidden under the snow and lurched violently to the side. Rowan heard wood crack, felt the whole rig list dangerously, and then they were tipping, supplies sliding, both of them scrambling to jump clear before the wagon completely overturned. They hit the snow hard, rolled, came up gasping and disoriented. The wagon lay on its side, one wheel spinning slowly. The horses had pulled free and were standing nearby, heads down against the wind, waiting for instructions that Rowan didn't have. You hurt? He shouted at Evelyn. No, you? I'm fine, we need shelter. But there was no shelter, just endless white in every direction, cold that was already seeping through wet clothes, and night falling fast. Rowan tried to think through the panic. They had some supplies from the wagon if they could salvage them, had the horses if they could catch them, had each other, had to be enough. Help me right the wagon, he told Evelyn. We can shelter under it. They fought through snow to the overturned wagon, put their combined weight against it, and managed to lift one side enough to create a small protected space underneath. Not much, but better than nothing. Rowan caught the horses, tied them close, and grabbed what supplies had stayed with the wagon. Blankets, some food, a canteen. They crawled under the wagon and huddled together while the storm raged around them, and Rowan felt the same cold terror he'd felt 11 years ago when Margaret was dying and he couldn't do anything to stop it. History repeating. Loss coming for him again. The frontier taking back everything it had briefly pretended to give. We're not dying out here, Evelyn said against his chest, like she could read his thoughts. I didn't survive Vermont and travel across the country and rebuild from a tornado just to freeze to death 5 miles from home. We might not have a choice. There's always a choice. We choose to keep breathing, keep moving, keep fighting until we can't anymore. She pulled back to look at him, her face pale but determined. I'm not ready to give up. Are you? The question hung between them like a challenge. Was he ready to give up? To let the frontier win again? To prove everyone right who thought he'd never recover from Margaret's death? No, he said. I'm not ready. Good. Then we wait out the storm and we walk home in the morning. Could be miles and snow this deep. Then it takes us all day. But we do it together and we survive. They spent that night under an overturned wagon in the worst storm of the year, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch, sharing body heat and blankets and determination not to let this be how their story ended. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. The cold was vicious, creeping through layers of clothing and blankets to find skin. Rowan's fingers and toes went numb. Evelyn's lips turned blue, but they kept breathing, kept holding each other, kept refusing to quit. Dawn came eventually because it always did, revealing a world transformed by snow. 2 feet had fallen overnight, maybe more in the drifts. The wagon was half buried. The horses had survived by standing close together, ice in their manes but still alive. "Can you walk?" Rowan asked Evelyn. "Have to, can't stay here." They salvaged what they could carry, abandoned the wagon and most of the supplies, and started walking. The horses carried what little they'd saved, but mostly they were there for moral support and the faint hope that if one of them collapsed, the horses could carry them the rest of the way. Walking through snow that deep was brutal. Every step required lifting legs high enough to clear the drifts, which exhausted muscles already drained from cold and fear. They moved slowly, resting frequently, encouraging each other when one wanted to stop. "Tell me about the garden," Rowan said during one rest, trying to keep Evelyn's mind engaged. "What are you planting in spring?" "Tomatoes. More beans. Maybe squash again if I can find good seeds." Her words came slow, slurred with cold. "Want to try corn? Rachel says it grows well here if you water it right. We'll build better irrigation, divert water from the cistern. That's a lot of work. We've done harder." "Have we, though? This feels pretty hard right now." "This is temporary. Garden's permanent." They kept walking. By noon they recognized landmarks. A distinctive rock formation, a dead tree they passed weekly. They were close, maybe 2 miles out. But 2 miles might as well have been 20 with how exhausted they were. Rowan's vision started to blur at the edges. His thoughts felt thick and slow. He knew those were bad signs, knew hypothermia was setting in, knew they needed shelter soon or they really wouldn't make it. "There," Evelyn said, pointing ahead with a hand that shook badly. "Is that smoke?" Rowan squinted through the glare of sun on snow and saw it. A thin column of smoke rising from approximately where their ranch should be. "Someone's at the house," he said. "Or we're hallucinating. Only one way to find out." They covered the last mile on pure willpower and arrived at their ranch to find Tom Fletcher and 3 other men working on the barn roof, a fire going in the house, and everything looking impossibly normal after the nightmare they'd just survived. Fletcher saw them and nearly fell off the ladder in his rush to get down. "Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead. Henderson said you left town before the storm hit full force. When you didn't show up this morning, we figured—" He stopped, really looking at them. "You need to get inside. Now! Sarah, we need hot water and blankets." The next hours passed in a blur of warmth and pain as frozen extremities thawed and people fussed over them with the aggressive care of folks who genuinely thought they were attending a funeral today. Fletcher's wife Sarah made them drink hot broth and wrap them in enough blankets to build a small fort. Rachel Patterson showed up somehow, took one look at them, and started organizing everything with her usual efficiency. "You 2 are the most stubborn idiots I've ever met," she said, but there were tears in her eyes. "Could have died out there." "Didn't, though," Evelyn managed through chattering teeth. "Pure luck." "Maybe, but we'll take it." By evening, they'd recovered enough to sit up and take stock. Mild frostbite on Rowan's fingers and toes. Worse on Evelyn's, but nothing they'd lose. Exhaustion that would take days to shake. Gratitude so overwhelming it was hard to process. "Why were you here?" Rowan asked Fletcher. "At the ranch?" "Came to check on you after the storm. Figured you might need help clearing snow or checking on animals. Found everything secured, but you 2 missing." Fletcher shook his head. "Scared the hell out of us." "Sorry." "Don't apologize, just don't do it again." After everyone left, insisting they'd check in tomorrow, Rowan and Evelyn lay in their bed and listened to wind rattle the new windows they'd installed after the tornado. "We almost died," Evelyn said quietly. "Yeah. And people came looking for us. Not because they had to, because they cared." "Yeah. I've never had that before. People who'd drop everything to make sure I was okay." Rowan pulled her closer, careful of her frost-damaged fingers. "You have it now. We both do. That's what community means." "I like it, even if it comes with Rachel Patterson organizing my life." especially because of that. She laughed weakly, and they fell asleep holding each other, alive against all odds, warm in a house they'd rebuilt, surrounded by people who'd shown up without being asked. Winter deepened after that, but they faced it with better preparation and help from neighbors who checked in regularly. The cooperative meetings Tom Fletcher had mentioned became a regular rhythm, ranchers gathering to share resources, solve problems, plan for spring. Evelyn joined the Women's Auxiliary and discovered she was actually good at organizing work projects, which surprised no one except her. The ranch survived the winter. More than survived, thrived in its own stubborn way. The cattle made it through with minimal losses. The barn held against wind and snow. The house stayed warm. And slowly, carefully, two people who'd spent years believing they were cursed learned to accept that maybe they'd just been unlucky until they found each other. Spring came late but spectacular, the desert exploding with wildflowers after all the winter moisture. Evelyn planted her expanded garden with Rachel's help and advice from 3 other women who'd shown up uninvited but welcome. Rowan worked with Fletcher and the other ranchers to improve shared grazing lands and build better water management systems. One morning in April, Rowan walked out to Margaret and Thomas's graves like he'd done thousands of times before. But this time felt different. The weight was lighter. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it wasn't crushing him anymore. "Things are good," he told the graves. "Better than I thought they'd get. I'm married again, woman named Evelyn. You'd like her. She's tough and doesn't take my crap, and she's helping me remember how to live instead of just survive." He paused, searching for words that felt adequate. "I'll always love you, both of you, but I'm letting you rest now. I'm choosing to live the life I've got instead of mourning the one I lost. Hope that's okay." The wind rustled through new grass growing on the graves, and Rowan chose to take it as permission. He walked back to the house and found Evelyn in the garden, on her knees in the dirt, checking seedlings with the focused attention she brought to everything she cared about. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and smiled, dirt on her face and joy in her eyes. "Tomatoes are coming in," she said, "getting to have enough for us and extras to share." "That's good. Better than good. Means we're not just surviving. We're building something sustainable." She stood and walked over to him. "You went to the graves. How'd you know?" "You have that look, the one you get when you've been talking to the past." "Is that bad?" "No. It's healthy. Means you're making peace instead of carrying war." She took his dirt-covered hand with her equally dirty one. "How do you feel?" "Lighter. Like I can finally breathe all the way." "Good. You deserve that." They stood in the garden together while bees hummed around flowering plants and birds sang territorial claims in the cottonwood tree. The ranch spread around them, scarred but standing, rebuilt by work and stubbornness and help from people who'd shown up when it mattered. "We did it," Rowan said. "We actually did it." "Did what?" "Survived. Built something real. Made a life worth living. We're not done yet. Lots more work ahead." "I know. But we're through the worst." "You don't know that. Could be another drought, another storm, another disaster we haven't thought of yet." "Probably. But we'll handle it together. That's the difference." She squeezed his hand. "Together. I like the sound of that." Summer came with its familiar heat, but this year they were prepared. The garden flourished. The cattle stayed healthy. Neighbors stopped by regularly, and they returned the favor. The cooperative grew to include almost every ranch in the territory, sharing resources and knowledge, and the kind of mutual support that made survival possible in a place that actively tried to kill you. On their first anniversary, Rowan and Evelyn stood on their porch and looked at what they'd built. The barn was solid and fully functional. The house had stopped looking new and started looking lived in. The garden was producing more than they could eat. The fences were straight and strong. 2 names were carved above the door, weathering but permanent. "1 year," Evelyn said. "Feels like longer." "In a good way or bad way?" "Both. Like we've lived several lifetimes in 12 months. That's the frontier, ages you fast." "I don't mind. The aging, I mean." She turned to look at him. "I like who we're becoming together." "Weathered and stubborn?" "Exactly." They kissed while the sun set over the mesas, painting the sky in colors too beautiful for a place this harsh, and Rowan felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for 11 years. Contentment. Not happiness, Happiness was too simple, too fragile. This was deeper. The bone-deep satisfaction of building something that mattered with someone who mattered, of surviving the worst and coming out stronger, of learning that loss wasn't the end of the story unless you let it be. Tom Fletcher stopped by the next week with news. Territorial governments offering land grants, he said over coffee at their kitchen table. Good land 20 miles northwest of here. They're trying to encourage settlement, offering 200 acres to anyone willing to work it. Why are you telling us? Rowan asked. Because I'm thinking of applying, building a second ranch, and I wanted to know if you two might be interested in land next to mine. Could build something bigger together, share resources, make both operations stronger. Rowan and Evelyn looked at each other across the table, having an entire conversation without words. Expanding meant risk, meant more work, meant betting on a future they were still learning to trust. But it also meant growth, opportunity, the chance to build something even bigger than what they'd already accomplished. We'll think about it, Evelyn said. After Fletcher left, they sat on the porch and discussed it properly. What do you think? Rowan asked. I think we've rebuilt once already. We know how to do it, and having Fletcher as a neighbor means we wouldn't be isolated? She paused. I also think it's terrifying. Yeah, but the good kind of terrifying, the kind that means we're reaching instead of hiding. You want to do it. I want to do it with you. Just me alone? I'd be too scared. But us together, we can handle anything. That's a lot of faith in two broken people. Maybe, but we've earned that faith. Look what we've built here. Look what we've survived. We're not the same people who started this. We're stronger. Rowan thought about that. Thought about the man he'd been when Evelyn first arrived. Hollow, isolated, waiting to die. Thought about who he was now, rebuilding, connecting, choosing life even when it was hard. The transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be. But it was real. Okay, he said, let's do it. They applied for adjacent land grants and were approved within a month. Spent the rest of summer planning the expansion, organizing resources, working with Fletcher to coordinate development. It felt impossible and exciting and exactly like the kind of challenge they needed. The territorial government sent a surveyor in September to mark boundaries and file official claims. He was a thin man named Wallace with sharp eyes and a tendency to talk too much. You're the ones who rebuilt after the tornado, he said while measuring their property. That's us, Evelyn confirmed. Heard about that. People said you were crazy to try, said the ranch was cursed and you should just walk away. People say a lot of things. They do. But you proved them wrong. That takes something special. He looked at them thoughtfully. This new land you're claiming, it's going to be even harder. More isolated, fewer resources. Most people would look at it and run. Most people aren't us, Rowan said. Wallace laughed. No, I suppose they're not. Well, for what it's worth, I think you'll make it work. You've got that look. The look of people who don't quit even when they probably should. Is that a compliment? On the frontier, yes. Everywhere else, maybe not. But we're not everywhere else. After he left, Evelyn turned to Rowan with a smile. We have a look, apparently. The stubborn look, the we don't quit look. I'll take it. Me too. They broke ground on the new ranch in October, working alongside Fletcher and his crew to establish basics before winter hit. Just a simple shelter and basic fencing to start. The real building would happen in spring, but it felt important to mark the land as theirs, to stake a claim on a future they were building together. On the last day of work before winter made construction impossible, they stood on their new land and looked at what they'd started. It wasn't much yet, but neither had been this ranch when they began rebuilding after the tornado. It's going to be beautiful, Evelyn said. It's dirt and rocks and a half-built shed. For now, but give us time. We'll turn it into something special. You really believe that? I believe in us. That's enough. Rowan pulled her close and looked at the land they'd claimed, the future they were building, the life they'd fought so hard to create from the ruins of their pasts. 2 years ago, he'd been a ghost in a dead house, waiting for permission to die. Now he was building ranches and making plans and married to a woman who'd taught him that surviving was just the first step, that living meant taking risks, that love wasn't safety. It was choosing someone despite knowing you could lose them. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For showing up, for staying, for refusing to let me rot in that house alone. You're welcome. Though technically I didn't have a choice, the agency sent me to the wrong place. Best mistake they ever made. Yeah, it was. They walked back to their original ranch as the sun set, tired and dirty and happy in a way that felt earned rather than given. The house welcomed them with warm lamplight and the smell of stew Evelyn had left cooking slow all day. Their bed was waiting, their life was waiting, and tomorrow they'd wake up and do it all again because that's what living meant. Showing up day after day, choosing each other, building something that mattered even when it was hard. That winter was easier than the last. They knew what to expect now, how to prepare, how to ask for help when they needed it. The community wrapped around them like insulation against cold and isolation. Rachel's auxiliary met at their ranch in January, and Evelyn hosted 15 women with the confidence of someone who'd finally figured out where she belonged. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. They planted both ranches, crops in the original garden, grazing grass on the new land. Split their time between properties. Worked with Fletcher to develop shared resources. Built and failed and rebuilt and succeeded in the messy, non-linear way progress actually happened. On a warm evening in May, 2 years after Evelyn first arrived at the ranch, they sat on their porch and watched the sun set over land they'd claimed from wilderness. You ever regret it? Rowan asked. Coming here, staying? Every single day, Evelyn said. Then she smiled at his expression. I'm kidding. No, I don't regret any of it. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts. They made this mean something. You're not cursed. No, I was just unlucky for a while. But luck changes. Mine certainly did. Day you showed up in my kitchen cooking supper like you owned the place. I was terrified, thought you were going to shoot me. Thought about it. But you didn't. You fed me instead. Gave me a chance. She took his hand. I'll always be grateful for that. For you seeing past the fear to what we could build together. They sat in comfortable silence while the desert settled into evening, and Rowan thought about all the ways a life could break and all the ways it could heal if you found the right person to heal alongside. He thought about Margaret and Thomas, resting under the cottonwood tree, part of his past but no longer consuming his present. He thought about Evelyn's dead husband, buried in Vermont under a gravestone that lied about who was responsible for his death. He thought about all the grief they carried between them and how they'd learned to carry it without being crushed. Some wounds never fully healed. Some losses never stopped hurting. But people learned to live with them anyway. Learned to build lives that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. I love you, he said, because it still felt important to say out loud. I love you too. Even when you're stubborn and impossible. Especially then. Especially then. The ranch spread before them, 2 properties now instead of 1, built by work and stubbornness and the help of people who'd shown up when it mattered. It wasn't perfect. Would never be perfect. But it was theirs, earned through survival and growth, and the kind of love that chose presence over safety. And that Rowan finally understood was what it meant to truly live on the frontier. Not just surviving the harsh land and brutal weather, but surviving your own grief, your own fear, your own belief that you didn't deserve happiness. Learning to build again after everything collapsed, learning to trust again after betrayal, learning to love again after loss. The frontier demanded everything from people, but if you were stubborn enough, brave enough, broken enough to refuse to quit, it gave something back too. Not safety or ease or comfort, but the chance to become more than you were. To transform survival into life, to prove that starting over was always possible, no matter how destroyed you felt. Come on, Evelyn said, standing and pulling him to his feet. Garden needs watering before dark. Can it wait? Plants don't wait. They live or die based on what we do today. Wise words. I have my moments. They walked to the garden together, 2 people who'd been broken and had learned to be whole, and watered plants that would feed them through another season. Above them, stars were starting to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched them struggle and survive and build something worth keeping. The frontier stretched around them, harsh and beautiful, and completely indifferent to human suffering. But they'd carved out a space in it anyway, made it home, proved that even in the most unforgiving place, 2 people could find each other and build something that lasted. Not despite their brokenness, but because of it. Because broken things, when fitted together carefully, could create something stronger than either piece alone. That was the real lesson the frontier taught. Not that strength meant never breaking, but that healing meant finding someone to hold the pieces while you figured out how to put yourself back together, and then doing the same for them when their turn came. Because survival wasn't a solo act, it was a partnership between people who refused to quit on themselves or each other, even when quitting would have been easier. That night, lying in bed with Evelyn's breathing soft beside him and the ranch quiet outside, Rowan felt something he'd thought was lost forever. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. The knowledge that his life mattered, that his choices had built something real, that he'd taken the worst the frontier could offer and turned it into a reason to keep living. Margaret and Thomas were gone. That would never stop being true or stop hurting, but their deaths no longer defined him. He'd built a life beyond loss, found love after grief, learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, it meant growing around the wound until it became part of your strength instead of your weakness. "You still awake?" Evelyn whispered. "Yeah." "What are you thinking about?" "How lucky I am. How close I came to missing all of this because I was too scared to try again." "But you did try. That's what matters." "We both did." "Yeah, we did." She rolled over to face him in the darkness. "And we're going to keep trying, tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, building something bigger than our fear. Promise?" "Promise." They fell asleep holding each other, two broken people who'd learned to be whole together, in a house they'd rebuilt after a tornado destroyed it, on land they'd claimed from wilderness, surrounded by a community that had shown up when it mattered. The frontier had tested them, had tried to break them, had thrown everything it had at two people who'd already lost too much. But they'd survived anyway. Not because they were perfect or fearless or unbreakable, but because they'd found each other and refused to let go. And in the end, that stubborn refusal to quit, on themselves, on each other, on the possibility of happiness after devastation, had been enough to build a life worth living. The ranch that had been a tomb became a home. The man who'd been a ghost became human again. The woman who thought she was cursed learned she was just unlucky until she wasn't. And together they proved that starting over was always possible, no matter how destroyed you felt, as long as you were brave enough to try and stubborn enough not to quit. That was the story the desert winds would carry across the territory for years to come. Not about perfect people or easy victories or fairy tale endings, but about two broken souls who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to build something beautiful from the ruins. And if two such damaged people could create something worth keeping, maybe anyone could. Maybe that was the point all along.